Okay, if we'll proceed with the roll call.
Mr. Nader. Mr. Moss. Mr. Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Rakucci. Mr. Denayo. Mr. Sevison. Mr. Gray.
Present. Thank you. Now we'll have a report from our distinguished planning director, Mr. Johnson.
Couple of items to update the commission on. The board held its quarterly meeting up at Tahoe this past Tuesday. A couple of items that were on that agenda. There was a third-party appeal for the North Star Flyer application. The applicant had requested that that item be continued off calendar to allow the applicant to better research and respond to the issues raised in the appeal. And so that item was continued off calendar. It will be re-noticed, and staff will make you aware when that hearing is set again. The board also heard a presentation on the status of the Tahoe Basin Community Plan. As the commission is aware, there will be a presentation to you in the very near future, so you will be caught up to speed on what's happening up in the basin. And lastly, there was a presentation on the Truckee River Corridor Access Plan. This is a new project that staff is currently undertaking, and we will make a presentation to you in late August or early September to let you know what's happening along that corridor. This is an extension of the bike trail from Squaw Valley up to the town of Truckee. At this point, there will not be an August 8th Planning Commission meeting. We don't have items set for that agenda, but there is a fairly lengthy agenda set for the 22nd. On August 22nd, the housing element will be presented to your commission for adoption. We have a project that I don't know that we've considered before the commission before. It's an appeal of a code enforcement fee. This is one where there was a code enforcement action taken, there was a fee associated with that action, and the property owner is appealing that fee, and that appeal comes before your commission for consideration. So we will be sure you're prepped and ready for that before that hearing. We also have a subdivision modification for a gate out in western Placer County, the Cabral Ranch project, and then a couple of minor use permits and rezones for here in the North Auburn area. That concludes staff's comments.
At this time, anyone in the public who would wish to address us on an item not on the agenda today may come forward and speak. And seeing no one jump up, we will proceed to our first agenda item, which is a vesting of a tentative subdivision map modification for Rancho del Oro Estates. Mr. Vivaldi, enlighten us.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the Commission. I'm E.J. Vivaldi with the Planning Services Division. So this item before you is a request to modify the conditions of approval for the Rancho del Oro Estate subdivision to allow two things. One, reduced right-of-ways for internal roadways, and also to allow additional grading beyond that originally approved. So I think most or several of you were here when this was originally approved. The project site is located on the north side of Olive Ranch Road, which is right down in this area. Miners Ravine runs along the north side of the property. Right now to the east of the project, they're currently developing the Olive Ranch subdivision. That's a new home company, but kind of gives you an idea of where everything is right there. This slide shows a copy of the vesting tentative map that was approved in 2010 and shows 89 single-family residential lots. So last month, the county staff met with the applicant and their new project engineer regarding the submittal of their improvement plans. At that time, the applicant brought to our attention some design and engineering issues that they encountered while setting road grades and evaluating the on-site drainage system. In order to address these issues, the applicant proposed several changes to the project. Most were found to be in substantial conformance with the approved map. However, the proposed changes to the roadway design and additional grading proposed required changes to the conditions of approval, and that's why we're here today. So jumping right into the changes, that slide that you see now is regarding the reduced right-of-way for the road. The project was originally required to provide a county standard plate R3 24-foot wide paved roadway within a minimum 40-foot wide private road easement. This included 2-foot wide shoulders on both sides with no parking allowed. And that's down right here. You see the two 12-foot lanes and 2-foot shoulders, and then with a 40-foot right-of-way that allowed, I think there's another 6 or so feet on each side of that, of the actual improved roadway. So what the applicant is requesting now is a reduction in the width of the private road easement from 40 to 28 feet. Excuse me. The physical paved roadway would actually remain unchanged at 24 feet. So what was originally approved as far as pavement, it would be exactly the same. It's just the invisible right-of-way line out there that would be reduced. By reducing that width, the adjacent 12.5-foot multi-purpose easements would be located closer to the roadway, resulting in less site disturbance with the initial construction of improvements. The 24-foot paved roadway would still meet the county standard design criteria to serve the number of lots and the size of lots for the subdivision. These internal roads are private. As you remember, this is a gated community, and they would not be maintained by the county, so staff is in support of this request. Let me go back here, just to point out. So the little exhibit down on below, all the highlighted areas in yellow, those are all the internal roadways that would be affected by this reduction in right-of-way. So as far as the grading, condition 13 requires that any grading proposed beyond what was shown on the preliminary grading plan must be referred back to the Planning Commission. The original project proposed to maintain natural grade to the greatest extent possible and not pad grade the residential lots. There was an allowance for fill within specific lots in the natural swell areas, and that was just basically to make these more buildable lots. The additional grading proposed at this time is to improve individual lot drainage for positive drainage away from the future structures and towards the roadways. This slide shows a little kind of a clear exhibit of what's really going on. This is a revised grading and tree impact map. The majority of the grading would occur on the residential lots within the center of Road Loop A, which is this area here. And as you can see, the original grading are all these areas outlined if you follow it within the roadway and highlighted areas. So the additional grading that's being proposed, and the engineer for the project may want to come up and get into specifics if you need to, but all these areas where you see the contours that go beyond the original grading is what's being asked for today. So these proposed grading changes will improve drainage for the on-site roads and residential lots, and they do not significantly alter the drainage overall across the entire site. These changes would eliminate many of the overland release areas and the ditches that you would have had previously between the individual lots. There's no additional grading proposed along Olive Ranch Road down in this area, as you can see. So there wouldn't be any additional visual impacts from what was originally approved. Impacts to biological resources would be minimal, as additional grading would occur primarily in the open grassland areas, and mitigation measures are already in place to reduce any impacts to sensitive resources to less than significant levels. So one other change that came about here was a request from Facility Services. They had requests that the timing of condition 56 be changed as it relates to the reimbursement agreement for that was associated with the Lawrence Sewer Lift Station and taking that offline. This would now occur after acceptance of project improvements, not prior to improvement plan approval. That's something I believe Facility Services and the applicant are in agreement on, and they can confirm that. So just kind of a cleanup item as far as that is. So that brings us to our recommendation. What we're asking the commission today is to find that the previously certified Rancho del Oro Estates EIR and the related findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations and the mitigation monitoring plan satisfy the requirements of CEQA for the modification that is before you. And mostly and lastly, approve the modification to the Rancho Del Oro Estates Besting Town subdivision map as reflected in modified conditions 1, 12, 38, 56, and 57A. These are all based on the findings in your staff report and conditions as modified. So with that, I'm available for any questions.
Let's see, one question I noticed is the old condition 33, which dealt with restricting no grading activities within the 100-year floodplain, and I noticed that was eliminated.
Okay, the reason that's eliminated is because that was a duplicate condition from the original approval. So that condition is actually in here under another number, and I believe it's 19. If you look at 19, there were two conditions that we found were duplicates. And that's on page 6 of 39, condition number 19, the same condition.
Okay, I see that now.
We just happened to realize that when we were going through to modify the conditions, but a very good thing to point out.
Okay,
So there is no grading permitted within the 100-year floodplain.
all right. I also noticed that on the map, it shows within the open space lot H, there's an excavation area, it says. Is that within the open space lot, or?
Are you looking over in this area, or am I looking?
It's further up. It's up towards the upper right of the map.
On this open space area?
Yeah. It says excavation area.
Right, it looks like it's slightly encroaches into that area. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, on the map, it shows it right in the middle. Maybe your map's different than mine.
That's the tree. You may want to go back to the grading.
Because, I don't know,
Impact map.
give me 1 second. Okay, so the area you're referring to, just so we're all talking about the same thing, this is open space H that runs along this entire area.
Right.
And then you see the edge of the residential lots, and then the grading is within the edge of those residential lots.
There's no additional grading
This
in Lot
is-
H. There's no additional grading in Lot H that's proposed that's changed with today's request.
So that where it says excavation area, there's no excavation going on there?
Well, where does it say excavation area?
It's in a white area there right next to the open space, but maybe that refers to all the white area on the map, I don't know.
Excavation area right next to the open space. Right.
And we may have the project engineer address that, just.
It does say it there. But it's not on the grading plan, so we may have to ask our applicant to clarify on the tree.
I don't have an answer. We'll have an answer here shortly.
That's okay.
I have one quick question. Usually when an applicant or a project comes into like reduce roadway width because we want to take the utilities closer to require less excavation, usually there's less excavation required, not more. Now this new grading, is it more or less than the previous plan?
So there's a combination of two things going on. The quick question is there's absolutely more grading going on site. And to tell you specifically what's going on, I'll give you some numbers. So speaking to the reduced right of way, there will be less grading associated with that because they don't have to extend those utilities out so far. So that would result in a reduction. However, to fix or improve the drainage system on
The
site,
whole system, it's an improvement.
there's going to be probably twice as much grading as previously was approved, but over a little larger area that grading was previously permitted. So the answer is yes, there is going to be a significant amount additional grading, even over and above what's being reduced
But
by
that's
the right of way.
that's to improve the plan and the drainage, and the reduction of the right-of-way actually is a reduction in some grading around there and stuff like that.
Correct.
And the other part of it, the increased part would be because they would want to improve the drainage, et cetera. Like
Correct.
you explained earlier. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Sampson?
EJ, are you essentially telling us that they're going to cut pads for foundations? Or is that the bottom line here?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say, it's more contour grading
Okay.
to get the drainage to flow, and having the engineer here to speak to that is probably going to give you the information you need. But the grading is limited to this area in here, and all these residential lots are, I'd say a good 60% of the lots are unaffected by this grading. And those that are affected, it's going to be more of a contour grading, not stepped pads and so forth.
Okay, yeah, because I remember we got into a discussion years ago on Bell Road on making it look like a sawtooth. And it was
Right, and
not pretty.
that's not the plan here.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I might, since the adoption and approval of this plan, staff has encountered numerous grading challenges in this project area, not just on this project site, but in the area. And so in concert with the applicant, the intent was to create a drainage and grading plan that would respond to and minimize and hopefully eliminate future problems that might be encountered. And so while it is an expansion beyond what was previously approved, it's in response to issues that staff has encountered in this project area.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mott?
EJ, when 24 feet works, why do we ask for 40 in the first place?
Engineering surveying, would you like to
Okay.
respond?
Hi. For the record, Rebecca Tabor with Engineering and Surveying. The Street and Highways Code requires a 40-foot minimum width right-of-way for public maintenance. So, and also in county code, private roads shall be designed to meet a public road standard. So, another aspect in county code is that we, staff, have a condition that we get an irrevocable offer of dedication over the private roads in case the county would come in and maintain those roads in the future. And then we're back to meeting the 40-foot width for the easement.
This is just a commitment up front that that's not going to happen, basically?
These will not be publicly maintained, ever. And there's gates, and we don't allow gates over public road easements, so they're private roads.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, just last question from me. Obviously, emergency services have checked out the 24 width, and there's no problem with any of the fire trucks or anything like that?
Fire requires a 20-foot paved width, so the 24 feet meets their minimum fire-safe clearance.
And turnarounds?
Yes, the cul-de-sacs do meet the turnarounds requirements of fire.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board? If not, do we have a representative from the applicant? I believe we do.
He doesn't look too good today.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, Marcus LaDuca, 3200 Douglas Boulevard in Roseville. On behalf of the longtime property owner, I'm pleased to be before you with support of your staff for approval of our changes to a number of conditions, as you've heard, to the approved Rancho de Laurel project. As we moved from the tentative map stage, preliminary drainage plan, preliminary grading plan, to actual engineered drawings for the improvement plans, we discovered a couple problems with the tentative map that had been approved in those preliminary plans. First, as you've heard with the 40-foot right-of-way, as you saw in the illustration, you ended up with these no man land on either side of 6 feet, and also pushed utilities because the PUE has to be outside of the right-of-way closer to homes, so where the dry utilities would be. So the idea was to not affect the road section at all, but not have these 6-foot strips on either side that aren't serving really any purpose with a private gated subdivision. So that was the first request. The second really had to do with, in terms of the grading, as you've seen, and it really isn't affecting the overall grading in the project. It's the timing. When individual lots are built, they're going to be graded. So the grading is going to take place. It was just a question of when that grading would take place, whether it be with subdivision improvements or with lot development. What we saw when we looked at this was there were issues relative to the grading and drainage on the site and the creation of a lot of drainage on individual lots that individual homeowners would have to maintain, as opposed to getting the drainage through the system, through a pipe system, into the roadways of the project. And so you would not have these overland release paths and other drainage ditches on lots that, if an individual homeowner doesn't maintain, creates problems for other neighbors. So with the proposed grading that we're looking at doing now with subdivision improvements, it'll eliminate a lot of those overland releases and those individual homeowner responsibilities. Even though they're the homeowner responsibilities, people have a tendency to not, they call the county to complain, fix my problem, and it's like, it's not our problem, it's your neighbor that should have been maintaining that. This will eliminate a lot of that. So we are prepared to start construction on the subdivision improvements this fall, assuming that the commission would approve our request today. We are moving forward with improvement plans. Your staff is checking them currently on a first check. So we would ask today, unless there's other questions from the commission, that you approve our request as submitted. I would like to ask our project construction manager to come forward and address the questions on grading that came up earlier relative to that lot H, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Please do.
Rob.
Good morning, Commissioners and staff. Robert Parrish, R.M. Parrish and Associates, on behalf of Scopus Investments, here to answer any of your questions or clarify the grading component that's been put in front of you for review and consideration. So on Lot H, what that actually involves is additional fill limit that was already contemplated as part of the initial tentative map grading that was approved initially. What's been done in the Lot H region is essentially just expanded the fill and the elevations to soften and allow for positive drainage to come towards the right-of-way. That allows for the ultimate shed to be collected into pipes that ultimately end up in the drainage basin located to the left of lots. I think that's 3.
So Lot H, it says excavation.
It's not excavation. It's actually just a limit of fill that's already within the footprints of the approved locations of the building envelopes, the pads.
So it's not really in Lot H then?
No, sir.
So Lot H stays the same?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have one more question too, and this is mainly probably just information for me, because I noticed that in condition 22, when you talk about pad grading, there's a lot of soil testing requirements that go with particularly the pads that are put in. And one thing that occurs to me is when you put down fill, sometimes it can take a few years before the soil subsides down to a level which is going to be stable.
Yes.
And I presume some of these requirements are to address that, but I guess how are you addressing in places where you fill and you build a house on it, possible soil subsidence underneath the house?
We do that through the support and observation of our geotechnical engineer, first and foremost, which is Youngdahl and Associates. The areas are being studied as we speak and prepared for those concerns. So what we do is borings and trench excavations down to depths that allow for us to determine the suitable and or not suitable conditions of the soils that exist, allowing for the soils to be placed in such a manner that subsidence is avoided. The conditions that are on this particular property, fortunately, are very conducive to the type of use with very little concern, with the exception of the areas that have been noted that were disturbed as part of the early on mining attempts that took place through in the ravine. Those areas will be handled separately in a fashion that allows for it to be equally as suitable in the end. But all of that is done through preparation, through over-excavation to sufficient depths, and then soil blending, moisture conditioning, and removal of organics and things of that nature that would allow for those sites to be completely suitable.
And compaction, I guess, is what you're doing?
Yes, through the various efforts, but yes, through compaction.
So you're not anticipating that you'd have to sink down caissons or anything like that?
No, sir. No, the soil and/or the nature of Granite Bay does allow for us to have a fairly good, stable condition there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we'll have from the public, anyone who wishes to comment on this application? And seeing no one, we'll pull it back and discuss. Any discussion within the board? Can I hear a motion?
I guess nobody will make a motion. I'll move that we accept the initial study, attachment E is complete, and make the finding that the previously certified Rancho del Oro Estates EIR with the findings of facts and statements of overriding considerations and mitigation and monitoring plan satisfies the requirements of CEQA. And two, we approve the modification to the Rancho del Oro Estates vesting tentative subdivision map as described in this report, subject to the following findings and attached modified conditions of approval. CEQA findings, vesting tentative subdivision modification maps, and those attachments.
Second.
All right, we'll have a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Looks like you can start.
Another close one.
All right, moving right along, the next item on our agenda is a tentative subdivision map modification for North Star, Highlands 2, with the applicant,
Staff first. You got EJ again?
I think so.
Greg?
Well, EJ didn't want to sit in for me. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Here's another subdivision modification for your consideration. The request before you at this time is a modification to a previously approved tentative subdivision map and conditional use permit to allow for the planned residential development associated with North Star Highlands 2. In 2005, the Planning Commission approved a master conditional use permit and certified a programmatic and project level EIR to guide the future expansion of North Star Resort and the surrounding areas. The Highlands area of North Star generally extends from this portion of North Star Drive southward and uphill to about the mid-mountain area and the southernmost stretch of Highlands Drive right here. Highlands is primarily a residential development approved for up to 1,450 residential units. The project level analysis allowed for the immediate development of the Highlands portion of North Star, and that included the Ritz-Carlton, which is down in this area, the Trailside Townhomes, which are right here, Interceptor parking lot up at the top when you first come into North Star off of 267 right here, the roundabout and other roadway improvements throughout the area. There's a 96-unit employee housing complex in this site too, and 2 as yet to be developed condominium structures. Those were all approved with Highlands, the original Highlands development. Subsequent phases of Highlands.
Before we go on, Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Did we get the issue resolved that caused us to continue it to start with as county?
Yeah, I'll address that at the end of the report here. I've got a little.
Well, I just was going to say, if we're not going to go forward again, we don't want to go through a whole report and
To answer your question, yes,
Okay,
that has
well,
been
that's good enough.
resolved.
I just didn't think it made much sense to have a long presentation and find out that we can't hear it. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Okay, so subsequent phases of Highlands, guided by the master plan, are to be reviewed and approved on a project-by-project basis. And one of the phases is Highlands 2, which included the development of 17 large lots or subphases, and that was approved for development by Commission in 2008. So the existing approval of Highlands 2 includes 576 residential units. They're all condominiums and townhomes at this point. 4,000 square feet of commercial skier service areas, 15,000 square feet of common homeowners facilities, and new and relocated ski trails. That's all within the general areas here that are in red. Following approval of the North Star Highlands 2 project, one final map, which is Lot 10B, right in the very center there, has been approved and recorded, and the development of 16 home-run townhomes is nearly complete. However, no other project components have moved forward. This is where the employee housing is proposed and approved with Highlands 2. That location would remain the same with this modification request. The 96-unit employee housing complex is in this site, so this would be 32 adjacent right to it, same area. Here's the remainder of the Highlands 2 project site. The areas in yellow are already developed with final maps and or structures. This is the Ritz I was mentioning earlier. Here's the village area, various single-family residential lots up here, and then townhomes. These are the townhomes that are constructed. Here is the proposed tentative map and modified tentative map, this tentative map, and conditional use permit. In the last few years, the applicant has discovered that the original Phase 2 vision, which was heavily focused on condominium development, no longer represents real estate trends. Additionally, construction financing for condominiums is more difficult to secure today than it has been in the past, and that's true. It's more difficult than it would be for townhomes and single-family residences. So based on these market realities, the applicant has requested a revision to develop more townhomes, fewer condominiums, and the introduction of some single-family residences. Single-family residences would be out here. The modification would also reduce, the modification would result in a reduction in overall density of the project from 576 units to 446 units. So it's a reduction in about 130 residential units. The modification would also reduce the number of large lots from 17 to 16. Because the recession has generally slowed development, the extension of time is being, for the expiration of the vesting tentative map is also being requested. Although two new areas of development are proposed, and that would be Lot 10G, and 10A2 down here, they have both been identified in the original Highlands EIR, and mitigation measures to reduce environmental impacts to those areas as a result of development have already been identified. An initial study was prepared for this modification, attached to your staff report, and it finds that the modified project would not result in an increase in any potential environmental impacts, which had been analyzed for the original Highlands 2 project. The modification request was presented to the North Tahoe Regional Advisory Council on June 14th of 2012, and they voted unanimously to recommend approval of the request. This project was initially set to be heard by your commission on July 11th. To address Larry's concern here, staff requested a continuance at that time in order to provide a response to a comment letter we received prior to the public hearing but after preparation of that staff report. The comment letter was prepared by Greg Gatto with Stoll Reeves, and this was on behalf of the Aspen Grove Owners Association. Mr. Gatto argues that the court's decision and judgment that he attaches to his letter are evidence of a violation of the grading ordinance on the site of a water quality pond that's located between the North Star Village lower parking lot, which is, right in here, and the Aspen Grove condominium subdivision, which is all here. Mr. Gatto further argues that the presence of a code violation in relation to the water quality pond precludes Placer County from processing any application request for development within the North Star area while the violation is pending. So staff response to these comments is provided in a memorandum that was prepared by Dan Dotai, Placer County Engineer Manager, on July 7th, 17th, 2013, and a copy of Mr. Dotai's memos attached to your staff report as Attachment F. Staff finds that neither the judgment nor any such determination precludes the county from processing or taking action on entitlement requests for other parcels within the larger North Star area unless a factual determination concludes that the same alleged code violations are found to exist on parcels that are seeking new entitlement requests. Because no Highlands 2 parcels are in violation of this or any other code section, and because no violations would result from the development of Highlands 2, staff has determined that the Planning Commission may move forward to consider this entitlement request. Mr. Dotai further states that there may or may not be a violation of the grading ordinance at the site of the quality pond, but any such determination will be made separately by the county and will pertain to the parcel or parcels underlying the water quality pond and not extend to all development within the North Star area. Mr. Gatto also states in his comment letter that you have there, in the event the county issues approval of a North Star project, of any North Star project, he says, a condition should be added that prohibits any diversion of water onto Aspen Grove property. To this end, staff recommends 2 new conditions of approval that you'll find in your recommended conditions of approval that require a more comprehensive drainage study, construction of retention-detention facilities to reduce post-project runoff levels equal to or less than pre-project levels, and annual monitoring to ensure the system functions as designed. Please note that these new conditions are intended to provide additional assurance beyond the mitigation measures, which have also been incorporated as conditions of approval, given the heightened scrutiny of the drainage issues related to the water quality pond in Aspen Grove. That staff recommends approval of the extension of time, the modified vesting tentative subdivision map, and conditional use permit, subject to the findings and revised conditions of approval attached in staff report. Staff also recommends that the Planning Commission adopts the CEQA finding included in Attachment D, and find that all environmental impacts associated with this Phase 2 project have been adequately addressed in the previously certified EIR, and implementation of the applicable mitigation measures will reduce all impacts to less than significant levels. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Question from the board?
I have one quick question. That water quality pond, is that what you said? Water quality pond. Now, is there drainage from any of these parcels that are part of this application drain into that pond?
They, most of this development for Highlands 2 shares the same watershed, and maybe I'll have Dan.
I guess the reason I was bringing that up is it said that in one of your comments was that these other parcels are not directly related to the other project that's complaining about this. But if in fact these other parcels do drain into this pond, wouldn't there still be some effect? And because there is some litigation still going on, wouldn't that still hold water, if you will, that maybe we shouldn't approve these other ones if they drain into the same water quality pond, which is adjacent to this other property that has an issue with it?
Yeah, because they share the same watershed, there could be that potential, and that's the reason we enforced or added additional conditions of approval to this. Standard BMPs should ensure, according to the EIR, they will ensure that drainage from any Highlands 2 development is not going to impact the village area. We've gone a step beyond that, beyond what we normally would require.
By putting those extra conditions that you already mentioned? Okay.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd throw that out.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you, sir.
All right.
We can now have a representative from the applicant.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, good morning. My name is Jim Telling with East West Partners. Again, this map is primarily to reduce the density associated with Highlands 2 to better adapt to the existing market right now. We are comfortable with the additional conditions that staff has recommended with this approval, and with that, would ask that if you have any questions, would be happy to answer them.
Thank you for your time and not hearing any questions coming forward. I'll
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And ask for any comments from the public. Seeing again, no one stepping forth, I'll bring the discussion, close the public hearing, and bring the discussion back to the board. Any questions amongst ourselves?
I do have,
Well, go ahead, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
well, this is just for clarifications. I was looking through the engineering report on this, and I guess not being a hydraulic engineer, I was a little bit confused, I guess, reading through it. And so maybe is the engineer here that produced the report, or somebody can answer to it? Yeah, this is Dan.
Yes. Good morning, Commissioners. Dan Data, Engineering Manager with the Engineering and Survey Division. I authored the July 18th memo that responded to Mr. Cox's letter.
It appears that you're very thorough in the report. I just was a little bit confused with some of the terminology here. And apparently there's 149 acres, and that's a watershed boundary?
The watershed, correct. The watershed inclusive, see if I can get this correct, runs from the village down here all the way up off your screen to about mid-mountain and back down. That watershed is about 149 acres. The Highlands 2 project resides in that watershed part of it, and the lower end of that watershed includes the lower part of the North Star Village.
Okay. And then, well, just looking at that picture there, I guess one of the things that I've always been confused about is Aspen Grove is down below the village parking lots apparently, and I can almost see a little pond there, but is that a pond that's a permanent pond that they're concerned about, or?
That is correct. The pond itself is on the North Star Village parcels, one of them, it's right there. And the property line runs right across between the village pond and the property for Aspen Grove, and Aspen Grove property boundary is about this large. And the issue here for this project, the Highlands 2 shares the same watershed. Water goes down there today, goes through the system, through the North Star Village. The concern here is that we don't add any additional water that's going to exacerbate the basin. And so that's why we have already, the project has a mitigation measure to reduce flows to pre-project conditions. We added the 2 additional conditions to broaden the analysis to make sure we're very comfortable with that finding, and then for the monitoring afterwards so that we can say confidently afterward, once the project is constructed, there are no additional flows added that will exacerbate the basin.
Okay, so you said it goes through the village. Now, with the North Star Highlands, obviously there's water that's traditionally generated in that area. Does that all go through that pond, or does it go through the drainage?
Not all of it. The Highlands 2 project is larger and has more than just one watershed, but part of the project includes this 149-acre basin.
And that
I'm
all
sorry,
goes
the
through the pond?
149-acre watershed.
All the water in that basin goes through the pond?
Not entirely. There's a bypass system, if I remember correctly. In general, when you go through ponds for treatment, it's for what's considered the first flush waters. You don't want to run all the water through. You run a proportionate amount to pick up the most contaminants. That is, the water quality pond is meant to let particles settle out. So not all of the water goes through, but the connectivity of that shed does run down to the North Star Village itself.
Okay, just to be clear, now, I think I read that Highlands 2 is going to have some of their own settlement pond areas.
That is correct.
To help the water clean up.
Correct.
And then the idea is the water will drain through the soil, or I don't know if it overflows into the natural drainage system or not.
Yeah, for their project when they develop, they will have an on-site system that will reduce their post-project flows to pre-project or less. And then it will shed down through the North Star, shed through the North Star area through the same natural drainage swales and sheet flow that it does right now. So the intent of this is that at the end of the day, when this project is built, there will be no additional water from this project going into the village than what goes there right now.
Okay, does all the water that's coming down through that drainage system, has the system been modified so it all goes into the parking lot or underneath, or what? I mean, you kind of have a natural swale that carries the water naturally down the mountain.
Correct.
Has that all been interrupted so it goes in or around the parking lot?
Not that I'm aware of. North Star Village is a unique area. has a lot of history to it. The storm drain system in the village itself is quite complex, and that existed even before the North Star Village project was built. There was already a network of storm drain systems underground through there. I would say that the majority of the flows, if not all of it, down in the area here around the ski runs, flow in their natural conditions as they always have. And the majority of it flows into, as the flows get down here, it flows through pipe networks that generally bring it around through the village. And it's almost a, you can think of it as, I guess, a network, multitude of pipes with different connectivities, and some flows come off on discharge points to the west fork of West Martis Creek here, a few other discharge out here. Some of them discharge into the basin, which then comes out to West Martis Fork right there. So the issue is the water gets out to where it used to, even before the North Star Village was built. What has changed and what has concerned the Aspen Grove homeowners is that the water, as it flowed out underground through pipes and discharge here, is now being diverted on the North Star property to this corner of the property being held there in the basin. After it's held for a while, it then discharges, and the action of that water being held is what is exacerbating the drainage issues on their property.
So is that different water than the water that's going to come off of North Star 2?
It's in the same watershed, but the North Star 2 project, I don't know if you have a feeling for the flows. It might be something on the order of 10 CFS in a shed that might be shedding 200 CFS. So in other words, it's a small part of that shed. And that small part will be mitigated with a project, so that when this project is complete, there will be no effective change in drainage that's received down here after the project than there was before the project.
Okay. I think I almost got my answer.
Okay.
It sounds like the drainage system's been all altered in that area, so you really don't know where the existing water coming off of North Star 2, how it really gets down to...
Maybe this will help answer. When the applicant builds their project, for instance, they have plans ready to come into plan check for I think it's a 6 or 7 acre property. What they will do, where the natural flows discharge their property right now before the project is built, when they put their system in, they will keep that same discharge point. And the system will retain their flows on their property up the hill. And so if you were to, let's say you were to hike up here today and see how on a rainy day and see how the shed came down and the water came down, and then 2 or 3 years after it's built, hike in the same area, you wouldn't notice any difference, because their system will discharge flows in the same location and of equal or less concentration than they were beforehand.
Okay, that's just discharge, but you know, I think we've also heard about subsurface flows. I guess that's a concern with the other project that we just reviewed up.
The subsurface component is after the water gets into the basin itself. So
What
it's
about
all
up above?
I'm sorry?
If you build, retention basins up above, then that's going to generate some subsurface flow, isn't it?
That would, but there's already natural water everywhere under the hill, and that's sufficiently far that it would not have, in my professional opinion, would not have any impact on, it would not cause any groundwater mounding, if that's what you're suggesting, that would impact a project that's about a half a mile away.
So it's not going to go underground and end up in the pond?
I don't see that it's happening, no. No, the issue from the underground component, as I understand it, is the collected water, surface water being brought to the pond. The pond is, in essence, an impoundment. It's holding and filling up with water, and that is what's driving the subsurface water that's presumably causing the damage on the Aspen.
So that's basically
property.
water off the parking lot?
And from the hill. But remember, the issue here is that it's being concentrated and held. So that concentration and holding it in a basin then causes a groundwater effect. Okay. At that, so in other words, it's localized. The groundwater effect is localized at the basin location where it's held.
There's a green area to the right. Is that a meadow area?
Out over here?
Yeah.
I believe so. And that's on the other side of West Fork Martis Creek. So the hydrology here is completely separate. The creek, as it runs on here, is a divide. So basically you'll have water that'll shed and reach the creek on this one side, and it'll shed from a different direction and reach the creek on this side. So once it reaches this creek, it daylights and it's no longer a shed. It becomes part of a tributary.
Okay. Let me see, it says in the county's position that the 149 acres, the uphill and substantially off-site watershed, as this specific watershed is reported to be 149 acres in size. I guess what I was struggling with is, what do you mean by substantially off-site?
The watershed itself probably comes around the village basin, runs up along West Fork of Marcus Creek, comes up perhaps to about the mid-mountain area, and then we'll come back down. I think this is pretty close to a divide here. In other words, a ridge on the mountains. This whole area then is a 149-acre watershed. The first project the Highlands 2 is going to build, as I understand it, is probably on the order of 6 or 10 acres, so that would be just a small, whatever, 10% or so of that watershed.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
You're making reference to 17 acres, so that's probably what you're talking about.
The 17 acres, as I understand it, is the North Star Village itself. So this site is 17 acres.
On-site. The North Star Village is on-site.
Correct. And it's important, too, to remember, and I mentioned that in my memo, and Jerry did in the staff report, that these are all separate parcels. This is a parcel, this is a parcel, there's other parcels up here. So they're legally saleable separate parcels under different ownerships. That's why if indeed there's a code enforcement or a code violation here, we would work with these homeowners to address that code violation, not necessarily withhold permits from homeowners up here. So what the court judgment found is that this is all in one watershed. So the court ruled that we don't want that watershed, any additional impacts from that watershed. And that's where the 2 additional mitigation measures come in, because we can say with confidence to your commission with those 2 additional conditions that this project will not add any additional flows down to the North Star Village Basin than would otherwise exist without that project going forward.
Okay. And that's with extra monitoring, right, that you're planning?
It is. It's a broadened extent of analysis, so we've asked for additional analyses so we can be certain of the analysis. The applicant has agreed. And then a monitoring program so that once the project is complete, it can be monitored effectively on the ground, and we can see those real-time results. And then, of course, you'll know with confidence then if you're mitigating your flows, it'll be right there in front of you, and we'll be able to demonstrate that. And they're going to provide annual reports to us to review, and we'll keep track of that. And after 4 years, if it's still in compliance, which we suspect it would, then we can close the book on it, so to speak, and say it was constructed as designed, everything works the way it's supposed to. We're confident it's not adding any additional flows to the North Star Village.
Okay, and then, I guess they say nothing's 100%.
Nothing's 100%, that is correct, but that's why we added the 2 additional conditions. So we already have a standard condition in there that requires them to mitigate their flows, but because of the sensitivity of the issue, we felt those 2 additional conditions just adds that extra level of confidence, because they're broadening their analysis, they're doing additional analysis for their project, and then they're going to do post-project monitoring to confirm that actual features in reality are functioning the way the numbers in the green report suggest.
Okay, and then if not, then what?
If not, and I believe the condition speaks to that, that we'll work with the applicant at that time to make changes as needed. And they have a security posted to guarantee that. So they'll get their security back, assuming the system gets modified if it needs it and is performing correctly. At the end of 4 years, we'll refund the security. So the security gives us leverage to continue to work with the applicant. And by agreeing to the conditions, they would work with us as well to make sure that if the system needs to be refined, to make sure it's not adding any additional flows, we'll work with them to make sure that happens.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just have one quick comment or question. Has Mr. Gatto seen your letter that you sent to us?
I presume so. It's on the county's website, public record.
You haven't heard from him?
I have not heard personally from him, no.
Okay, seeing no further questions, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll bring it back for discussion. Marilyn, any further discussion, questions?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, now I'll try again. If there's no other questions or comments, I'll follow staff's recommendation and accept the initial study as set forth in attachment C. Excuse me, I don't have my microphone on this. In attachment C, that relies on the previously certified North Star Highlands Master Plan EIR as the appropriate environmental document for this project pursuant to sections 15063B1B, initial study, and approve the mitigation monitoring and reporting program as set forth in attachment E, subject to the CEQA findings contained in attachment D. And further, number 2, approve the modification to the vesting tentative map, subdivision map and conditional use permit subject to the following findings and modified conditions of approval set forth in attachment B. And further, number 3, approve the extension of time to add 2 years to the expiration date of the vesting tentative map subdivision map. Do we want to do all of it together, or do you want to separate these items?
No, you could do it together.
Okay, I'll go on then and add to my motion the findings for CEQA and the vesting tentative subdivision map modification findings as listed in the agenda, and the conditional use permit findings, and the planned residential development modification findings, and the extension of time findings. And I think that's all of it. Okay.
So moved and seconded, call for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Good luck to you. I'm going to call for about a 3-minute break, and we'll take the last agenda item. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, commence with the final item on our agenda. We'll now commence with the workshop on community centers for Placer County. George will address us first and inform us of everything we need to know.
Or I will try. George Rosasco, Supervising Planner with Planning Services Division of the Community Development Resource Agency. This is the third workshop on community centers. The last two times I've given pretty expansive staff reports. I'm not going to do that today. Essentially what I'd like to talk about is at the last workshop there was some new information, or not new information, but some new decisions that we really hadn't talked about too much. They came to the forefront. One was that for event centers in agricultural zones, that the commission thought it was a good idea that probably most of those get use permits. That was one thing that came out of the last hearing. The other thing was we had proposed 2 new definitions to replace the existing community center definition. And the commission thought that we needed to be more specific with our conditions, so we've come back with 5. And then the rest of the issues are still the same. There's 15 issues. Same 15 issues that we discussed. I've added one, which is about parking. Since our last workshop, I went out and I looked at approximately 11 counties and their ordinances that pertain to event-type uses in their zone districts. And I've tried to pick and pull from all those ordinances and come up with the very best solutions to the issues that we've discussed in the previous 2 workshops, and that the Planning Commission has voiced concerns about. And I think when you look through the discussion of issues, there's 15 items, and there are solutions and ideas about how to address all those things. But ultimately, that decision is up to you to give us a recommendation about how you think you would like that addressed. The other thing I should mention is between this workshop and the last workshop, we did meet with 4 members of the public: Dawn DuPont, Carol Rubin, Marilyn Jasper, a lady sitting behind me whose name I can't remember, and Patricia Burke. I could not remember her name. And they gave us some ideas about how they thought these things should go forward. While we didn't put their ideas specifically into our staff report, they did have some fairly good ideas, and we kind of synthesized some of those things into this ordinance for you to look at about more definitions, sort of a tiered stepping up in the agricultural districts. But what I'd really, or what staff would really like to have happen today is we would like to go through each one of these items, and I have it in a PowerPoint, and the definitions, the parking, security issues, maximum events, maximum attendees at events, size of property. And I'd like you as a hearing body, if you choose to give us direction about the way you would like it to go. Because the next time we come back, I'd very much like to have an ordinance, a proposed ordinance for you to review and make edits to and that sort of thing. So I really don't have anything other than, let me run through these really quick. I left the fragmentation slides in. Oh, we are not moving quickly today, in case that came back up. But essentially, I have about 15 of these slides that have the pertinent questions, and they go in line with each one of the discussion issues outlined in your staff report. And I would also like to say at the last workshop, the other issue that came up was about fragmentation and the smaller pieces of property that are in the county and the challenges that presented. So some of the solutions and things that we think might work have taken that into account. So I really don't have anything unless you have any questions. There's a couple ways you could do it. You could take public comment right now. You could go through these one at a time and then take public comment and then act if you so choose. It's really at your discretion how you want to go about doing that. Some of these won't take very much time. Some of them will probably be about a minute and a half. Some of them might be substantially longer.
I don't know, I'm thinking if you went through them one at a time, because in that way from the public, if there's something that's maybe in here that they're not quite understanding, it might answer a question or something, so it's, I think it might speed the process up.
Right. I agree.
All right, let's proceed.
I just want to throw something out, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair. George, I went over this very extensively, and what I wanted to say is there's been a lot dumped on you and your staff to kind of filter through this process, and I think you've done an outstanding job of really narrowing this down for us to take a look at. So
thank you.
I want to thank you for all the effort, because I know that's been a big effort to get it to this point. So I would agree with the other members that the best thing is just to address each one.
So
Proceed.
So essentially with definitions, we've come up with 5 new definitions for essentially community center. What you have is you have a definition of community center, which means a facility which may be located on public or private property. And essentially it is, as we've discussed previously, Grange halls, community-sponsored meeting halls, veteran halls, that sort of thing. They are designed to be used by the local community for local events. But with full disclosure, they are used for events, sometimes that aren't locally focused. However, that is not the main thrust of them. There are weddings at these things. There are parties. There are those sorts of things. But by and large, that is not what they are there for. Then you go on to the second definition, which is a commercial event center. That is simply an event center for any kind of social gathering in a commercial zone. It does have the ability to go in a few other zone districts, such as office professional, some of those other things, but by and large, they're all commercial zone districts. Some of those do need a use permit, or if you choose to, would need a use permit, like office professional, commercial plan development, that sort of thing. As a matter of right, they could go in general commercial and heavy commercial with design review. And then what we did, and because this is really the thrust, where the controversy comes up, is about event center type uses in the agricultural district. And what we've come up with is 3 sizes: a small agricultural event center, intermediate agricultural event center, and large agricultural event center. And it starts out at small at 10 acres with 100 or less attendees for events. Then it goes to 20 with 200 or less. Then it goes to 40 with 400 or less. Now, some of the questions that may come up with regard to these definitions can't be truly answered until we run through the rest of the things and we start talking about setbacks, noise requirements, parking requirements, and that sort of thing. So it's sort of a process. As we go along, it builds. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions about the proposed definitions?
Well, I do have one just to help distinguish. And I think of like the community center, and you may be able to answer this easily. I don't know. I kind of get confused by these things. But we've included granges, which is, pretty clear. That's been the traditional view that they're part of the community center. And they've had a traditional purpose. It's probably unlikely that we'll see many more proposals for granges in the agricultural or in any other areas. But there's other kinds of organizations that, and I'm thinking like the Elks. Say the Elks, they find a parcel and buy it, and then they want to develop a new Elks Lodge. Where would that fall in these definitions?
We actually have a separate definition for that. We have it under membership organizations and I believe maybe fraternal organizations, but membership organizations. So it's really not covered under this definition.
Okay. And I guess granges are not membership organizations?
I'm sorry?
Granges?
Grange is, in some instances, a membership organization, but we do specifically call out like Elks and Moose Lodges and that sort of thing as a membership organization.
Okay.
Grange is an example. I believe that there is some membership, like farmers used it traditionally for insurance and that sort of thing, and there's some membership.
Okay.
So I guess it could cross over, I guess, actually, to answer your question. A Grange could cross over into a membership organization.
And so then if they wanted to open up a new one, they'd have to follow that
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would expect, to be honest with you, based on the definition of community center, that we probably won't get any applications as defined in this staff report. I think in the entire time I've worked here, we've never gotten an application for a community center like a Grange or a Veterans Hall. The only time I think a community center might come into play is in a subdivision type scenario where someone, or like mobile home parks, where they actually have a center where people go and they have their HOA meetings and some other things. It's not quite a country club. It's more just like a meeting facility. I think that's the one place where you might see community centers still come into play.
But see, like another one, and I think you probably can answer this one very simply too, but just to be clear on it, like, a lot of golf courses are connected with a subdivision, but there are some, like in the county, Turkey Creek and the Ridge, that actually they have a function, a part of a function that would serve as a community center, but they also are a golf course and whatever else, sales and that kind of stuff. And so they what category would they be covered under?
Outdoor commercial recreation.
Okay.
Separate definition.
Okay, thank you.
George, again, I like the fact that you broke this down so that we have some more broad sort of descriptions that get more specific to the particular venue that they're going after. In your mind, I mean, I'm going to go off something Larry said the last time we talked. In your mind, how many of these designations would we have where there would be public hearings on them? Because I think one thing we talked about last time is being able to sort of describe it so that people knew what kind of criteria that they would have to be able to fit into, but that we wanted to have the public be able to have the opportunity to give input to that, especially the impacted people in the particular area. And rather than having staff making those sort of over-the-desk sort of decisions, would these be all hearing provided so that people could give input in the community?
The direction that we're going in now would require that almost every one of these go through a use permit process, with the exception of commercial event centers in C2 and C3, which are just our heaviest, biggest commercial areas. They're like where Target is, where Kmart is, that sort of thing. The rest of them would have to go through a use permit process. However, what staff's hope is that when this ordinance is done, well, they will be going through a public hearing process. There'll be very defined and definitive regulations. So it'll be, you need to have a parcel this size. You need to meet this requirement. You need to have this much parking. You need to have your outdoor entertainment all inside or outside. Should be very bright, defined lines. So when you get to the public hearing, it'll be more of a discussion about a few things, but most things should be pretty much spelled out. That would be staff's hope by the time we're done.
I obviously don't know what the other commissioners are saying, but I'm really supportive of how you presented this.
Oh, thank you. Are we ready to move?
Mr. Chair?
Get involved in these.
Well, I thought he was going to finish his presentation.
Yeah.
You want to go through all of them first?
Right.
or
I think we ought to
are you
go
gonna
through
let
them all.
let
And
the
then
public get
But
involved?
no,
Public can
after
make
he's
notes.
made his presentation, if he answers some of the questions that people have, then they don't need to go through it again.
So essentially, are there changes needed to proposed allowable zone districts? So essentially,
Mr. Chair, if I might, what staff might recommend, so it's fresh in everybody's mind, I think it might be best if we got public testimony after each one, so that it's current, and if there's any issues from the public, the commission is able to respond to them and not having to go back and try to recall what was said.
Well, the only problem I see with that is if everyone speaks on every item, we'll be here till tomorrow.
Yeah. We'll defer to you. We just want to be sure that the public's comments are actually accurately captured in the process.
Okay, well, I think we'll proceed the way we're going right now, but taking under advisement, Mr. Johnson, certainly.
So essentially, I can give you in a nutshell what we're talking about zone districts. A community center is actually allowed in an extremely broad range of zone districts and would be handled with a use permit. They're specifically spelled out, but you can have them in residential single family, residential multifamily. because they truly are intended to be for local community events and that sort of thing, and that's the main thrust. So all of those would be handled on a case-by-case basis through a use permit. Commercial event centers would be allowed as a matter of right in C2 and C3 with design review and that sort of thing and parking requirements. They would be allowed conditionally in C1, which is neighborhood commercial, CPD, which is commercial plan development, and office professional, highway service, and resort with a conditional use permit. They would not be allowed in residential single-family zone districts. Agricultural event centers would be conditionally allowed in residential agricultural, residential forestry, and farm zone districts with approval of a conditional use permit. Does anyone have any issues with that? Do I take that as a no? Okay.
No.
Not so far.
Okay.
And not so far, right.
And then with regard to the minimum, and some of these things, the community centers and agricultural, and commercial event centers would just be subject to the regular parcel sizes in those zone districts. When I talk about zone districts, I'm really talking about the agricultural event centers because that really is where the crux of the issue is going here. So a small agricultural event center would be required to be on 10 acres, or could be required to be on 10 acres, intermediate on 20, large on 40. Those are sizes that we thought were appropriate based on other counties that we looked at. Those could be made larger. They could be made smaller as we move along, depending on what we think is appropriate. Not what we think, actually, what you think is appropriate.
But I guess, to me, when I read it, those were fine, turnout points. And at any rate, I still think that because we're going to have a public hearing.
Right.
Where we're going to be evaluating the specifics of the site, that there's a proposal, as
right.
well as, working towards, there'll be an environmental document and conditional use permit. And so, at any rate, I'm just stating that I think those are fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah. I would agree with that too, and that if somebody comes in and they have 9 acres, they could certainly apply for a exception on their case, so that we could decide whether it's appropriate or not.
Okay.
I agree with Wayne, but not with Richard.
You don't agree with me? Thank you very much.
So the next issue that comes up is there's been a lot of talk about reducing size and bulk of event centers or agricultural event center type uses in agricultural zone districts. The way that I think in my research that most places have handled that is not by making a square footage requirement about the event center or a height requirement, but by increasing setbacks. The setback that I most commonly came across is 200 feet from exterior property lines. Do I know why people came to that conclusion? I don't. The only reason I can tell you is when I sat down and figured it out, if you take a square 10-acre piece, which we have very few of those in the county, but that was my starting off point, and you do a 200-foot setback, you wind up with about 4.5 acres, 4.4 acres that would accommodate the event center use. So I think that's probably where most people jumped off. You also see requirements that are much harder to enforce about 100 feet from exterior property lines, but no closer than 200 feet to any residential uses. That's a difficult standard to enforce. So my suggestion would be if you are interested in putting in a setback, that you think about it from the proposed event center's property lines inward, whatever you think is appropriate. 200 is the one that seems to come up very commonly in the 11 counties that I looked at.
I would propose the 200. I mean, that's my bias.
We're going to have people in the audience afterwards. We'll just put that there. That's good for me.
Okay.
Yeah, because again, if somebody has less than 200 feet, they can always apply for an exception, and then we can decide based on the configuration of the property.
We're talking about different sized community centers.
Well, let's have a discussion about this applying for an exception, because once these are printed in an ordinance, then from the planning perspective, you're going to make those a solid boundary. I mean, if it's 200 feet in the ordinance, and, you know, if somebody comes in with a project and they want 195.
Mm-hmm. What happens?
Yeah, what happens?
Okay, well, there's two ways. You can write the ordinance that it can't have a variance. I mean, you could define an intermediate, let's say an agricultural event center that has a 200-foot setback. That would probably make it set in stone and very difficult to do. Or you could simply put it as a requirement, and then if someone needs or has a very good reason to change that, you could review that as part of the use permit, or you could also review it as part of a variance to a required setback. So there would be ways in the overall review to look at things on a case-by-case basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, also, if we had them set up as standards as opposed to finite code requirements, that would allow your commission and the board more latitude in making modifications to those determinations.
And I think that needs to happen because, as George pointed out, you know, properties are not nice and square like they
Right.
would like to see them. They're all going to vary, and so I think you need to have some latitude to make the appropriate decision.
And they're not flat, so you may have to scoot something to the side to stay off the cliff or something.
Mr. Moss?
I think it makes a difference too, whether it's an indoor event or an outdoor event, how big the setback should be. If you can contain it all within a building, then you probably could hug a property line a little closer than if you're outdoors and have amplified music outside and that kind of thing.
Well, just so I'm clear, because I'm a little bit, we're talking here basically about the center itself, not about events being held at these different centers. And so we've got to, you know, make sure that we're talking apples and apples, oranges and oranges here. And
Well, but an event center is a parcel, not necessarily a building.
Yeah, as we move along, that's what I was saying, this sort of builds. As you make decisions on certain things, it affects decisions on other things. What you're talking about, if you decided there was a 200-foot setback, you could make provisions with regard to that setback, that all outdoor activity associated with that event center happens inside of that 200-foot setback, or outside of that 200-foot setback, depending on how you want to view it. So nothing happens within that 200-foot buffer. You might decide that maybe you can have parking within that 200-foot buffer. And then what Mr. Moss was alluding to about noise and that sort of thing, that really, and we have a question about noise coming up, it really does depend on what happens with regard to noise. How are we going to regulate noise? Is all amplified music going to need to be inside? And if it is all inside, maybe a 200-foot setback is not really necessary. If there's going to be some outdoor activity, maybe it is. So as we move along, these things will build and play off each other.
any other questions?
I thought this was going to be easy.
What was that?
I thought this was going to be easy.
Only easy day was yesterday. The next thing deals with just maximum event size. As far as I can tell, from county to county, this tends to be a highly subjective question. There is no rhyme or reason. I see events ranging from 50 people to 450 people. It really is sort of a subjective question. What I kind of just threw out as a basis was small agricultural event centers, 100 people, intermediate, 200 people, large, up to 400 people. Those numbers can go up, can go down, depending on what may or may not be appropriate. Like we talked about, they could be just a guideline starting point, and then if someone is on 10 acres, but they're nowhere near any other person, maybe it's appropriate for them to go beyond that. But if they're on 10 acres and they're hemmed in by a bunch of small pieces of property, maybe it really is appropriate only for them to have 100.
So then you're, in your mind, you're viewing this more as a guideline as far as the numbers?
I'm not viewing it anyway at this point. I'm waiting for direction about how you would like me to view it.
I think what you just said earlier, 100, 200, and 400, and the three different sizes that we said are good starting points, is a good place for starting on the size.
Right.
Those sound good.
It did. And
from your research, it sounds like you put the right number of people in the right size parcels to start with.
And generally, that is about what those sizes are
correspond to what other people do.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Moss.
I think in addition, though, to just the size of the parcel, you have to look at the ingress and egress to that parcel.
Yeah, but that's.
As a whole separate thing, because 40 acres and 400 people on one road could be a whole different scenario than that same 40 acres and 400 people, off of Sierra College Boulevard versus Gold Hill Road or something like, I mean, it's not an apples to apples comparison.
I would absolutely agree. And you're constantly 2 steps ahead of me. We're coming to the access issue, and that's one of the other things we want direction on.
George, I have a question on
Well,
that.
I do too, as a matter of fact.
Sorry, go ahead.
And as we're going through these 15 or 16 points, is it the case that they're dependent on each other? That is to say, if we have a small event and it's allowed 100 people, if they have this much parking and this much access, is that the way that the ordinance would generally read?
Yeah.
It's not individually taken, it's all
Yeah,
together?
generally speaking, there would be a hierarchy.
Okay.
If you're going to have this many people, you need to have this type of road.
So
you need to have this kind of parking.
George, my question is, if there's going to be a large event, the larger the event, the greater potential for impact.
Mm-hmm.
Is there at some point, especially for these larger events, that they should come in and get a permit so that somebody's reviewing it to make sure that they're in compliance of that activity?
You mean beyond the conditional use permit?
Yeah, for a specific event. I'm saying if they are going to reach a certain, we're saying, okay, you can go to 450 on a larger event. Should we, and I'm just asking the rest of the commission members, should there be a point where there's actually a staff review to make sure that the proposed event is not going to have unreasonable impact on the community? I'm just throwing that out.
If you, as a commission, chose to decide that if you go beyond a certain point, there even has to be some review beyond the use permit. I think normally what you're describing is if you had a use permit and you were allowed to go up to 250 people, let's say, okay? And once a year you wanted to have a large party on 4th of July. I think we could handle that through a temporary outdoor event permit. You're allowed to have 2 of those a year. I think we could have someone come in and simply go through the TOE process, temporary outdoor event process, and we would look at their use permit. We would decide, okay, you can do this, you have this kind of road. It looks pretty good for the 400 people. Where are you going to park them? Are you going to have, what kind of bathroom facilities you're going to have? So at least in 2 of those sorts of things, we already have something in place that we could use if it exceeded the use beyond their use permit.
Are we saying in these large event centers that they are supposed to be set up so that they can handle up to 450 from day one, so that maybe this is not an issue?
Well, that would normally be how an ordinance would work. If you have 40 acres and you're going to have 450 persons, you will have infrastructure, you will have access, you will have bathrooms, you will have enough parking for 450 people.
Okay, maybe it's not an issue then.
Yeah. If you want to go beyond that, I think we can have.
I think the issue
temporary outdoor
becomes,
event permit.
we can set standards for the event centers. The events themselves may need to be permitted if they don't meet the exact standards that are here. Does that sound about right?
Heard separately.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Maximum number of events goes hand in hand. The number I see in agricultural areas, I'll be blunt with you, in most counties is between 6 and 24. That's the number that I see. I've asked the question, does anyone know, did you have some formula? No. It's what we thought was appropriate. So really it becomes, again, it's a subjective issue about what is appropriate. And maybe that's something better left to a use permit, depending on certain circumstances. Maybe you want to cap it at no agricultural event center shall have more than 50. And that through the use permit, you might be allowed less than that.
Well, I think there's going to be circumstances where you may qualify because of the acreage you have, but in fact, you shouldn't have as many people there for other reasons, and so it's going to be a moving target.
So maybe you want to look at capping a maximum amount of events in agricultural event centers, and then it's through the use permit process, maybe walking it back or tearing it up.
How do you track that, George?
how do you track?
How many events they've had? If you kind of turn them loose, I mean,
Right.
they could have as
You
many.
mean like we allow you 24 and all of a sudden you're having 65?
Right, I mean, how are you going to track it?
That would simply come back to a code enforcement issue and coming up with better code enforcement options.
Then the neighbors will have to kind of click off at how many events.
Essentially, we would get a phone call, and we would go out and we would start talking to them.
Could it be built in to have a staff level approval annually? In other words, you wouldn't have to come through the public hearing process if everything was fine, but if you had been violating one or more conditions of your original approval, and you came back in 1st of January for the next year's ongoing renewal, you would say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't renew it because you violated the conditions of your existing permit. I don't know if you want that much latitude. That may be a nuisance.
I don't know. I would defer to county council. I'm not sure at a staff level that it would be appropriate for us to make that determination and essentially revoke someone's right to operate. I think we would have to come back to the original hearing body to do that.
Well, you may have to do that if you find that they're in violation. I wouldn't necessarily say that was wrong.
Right.
I just think that we've had so many cases of people saying, oh, well, you know, I'm supposed to only have 50 people here, but I don't think anybody's really paying any attention. I'm going to have a bigger...
I would tell you, one of the things you might want to consider is we already have a process to revoke use permits. We don't use it a lot, but in an instance where we think a community center or someone is actually going beyond that, staff could very much more quickly just say, we're taking it back to the commission. This is what we think.
Okay.
We're going to write a staff report. We're coming back. You plead your case. We'll plead our case. We'll let the commission decide.
You convinced me.
Okay.
Mr. Moss.
Say, George.
Yes.
Mr. Moss.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moss. I already recognized.
Oh,
Mr.
Moss, okay. He's down at the other end.
He doesn't count it.
It seems to me kind of what's brought this all on is people living around these facilities are not able to enjoy their own property and have some sanity because of the number of events and what it's doing to them, and then concern over the additional traffic coming to and from, or the two big issues. Obviously, the smaller the number of people, maybe could up the frequency of the event. I mean, it really doesn't matter if there's 50 people there every day, as long as you don't hear them and you're not getting run off the road by some tuned-up party goers coming out of the place. But there should be, you know, some consideration for the size of the event along with the number.
Yes.
The frequency.
Yeah, I would agree. I understand. And we can look at that.
Richard?
Yeah, I guess I kind of have a similar concern because on this one, we're not talking about the number of people. We're talking about the number of events.
Yes.
And there could be a crossover between the two of them, so there's some discretion that needs to be applied there. But, you know, if we set this number at a point, then we potentially could be affecting the viability of somebody's proposal. And they have to come forward with a proposal that's economical.
Right.
And if the nature of the events and the size of the events and that kind of stuff would work in the terms of the conditional use permit, it seems like by setting too hard of a line on the number of events, that could be dangerous in terms of people actually having a viable proposal.
Right. So we could look at a tiering proposal. We could look at capping it at a maximum amount of events, and then you could step it back. The other thing that's coming up here is in agricultural event centers, there's a question that we were going to ask for direction about. Do you want to see a verifiable ag use in connection with these? I pretty clearly have heard that you do from the last hearing. And so that would also play into the number of events, I would think, because if you have a viable ag use going on, then the event uses that you have on that site would be in conjunction to that. So that also affects the number.
Well, let me ask you this, George. Then if it's an agricultural event center, that could be determined before any event, correct?
To get a use permit, we would have to determine that you have the viable agricultural use.
Right, and that's for the establishing the center itself. then the event is a subsequent from that, and it has to follow other criteria to be held there. So
Right.
what we're looking at is two different questions here.
Right.
It's the actual event centers, or agricultural event centers, or community centers.
Right.
And secondly, how the events will be held and controlled at those centers, correct?
Right.
Okay, thanks, that's just clerical.
Yeah.
I'd just like to make a comment on this, on the number. I think some good comments have been made between the connection to agriculture, but we are talking about agricultural zoning here, at least
Right.
in the specific.
Yeah.
I think, in my opinion, less is better than more,
Right.
unless you have a complete connection with what you just said, George, to the agricultural component.
Right. And like I said.
That's just my own opinion, because that's why this whole issue came up. We were putting basically commercial-type enterprises in agricultural zones.
Yeah, what I can
I
do.
mean, that's a real reason.
Are we on is that a subsequent question that you're going to ask about the agricultural nexus?
Yes.
I am.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Ask.
You want me to skip right to the ag part right now? Well, let's skip right to the ag part. Basically, it's later on, but since we're talking about it right now, the on-site agricultural issue that comes up, if you're going to have a small, intermediate, or large agricultural event center, is there a requirement in your mind that it be a viable ag use on site? The easiest way that staff was able to find a way to verify ag use would be to essentially use the same standards as the Williamson Act. Essentially, it's a 10-acre minimum, although you wouldn't need to apply that if you decided to allow event centers in agricultural districts on smaller pieces, but a monetary requirement, which is $4,500 a year of ag production. You could even go so far as to say is that needs to go on in perpetuity while the agricultural event center is there, and if that stops, you no longer have the ability to have an agricultural event center. We can verify that by bringing in the ag commissioner. You could look at something and say they have the potential for $4,500, but let's say the mandarin trees aren't producing yet, but there's 150 of them in. Or you could simply say, you need to show us that you have $4,500 in revenue in the past year from your agricultural use before you apply. But I think the real way that you verify it is through verification in conjunction with the Agricultural Commission's office of a monetary amount made from agricultural production, whether it's cows, calves, sheep, mandarins, anything.
I think it always went quite there monetarily that you can't say marijuana or something and get the number up right away. The question I really had though was, does any of this conflict with the contracts we have with the farm?
Well, my proposal was not that we put these into contracts. My proposal was that we use the essential requirements. I think if you wanted to have an event center on an actually contracted Williamson Act piece of property, there would be some conflicts that would not work well.
So we could use Williamson standards without
having them contracted. Right.
Because I think the minimum acreage on the Williams Act is like 80 acres or something.
I think it's actually 10.
Yeah. Is it only 10 now?
I believe there are some instances where you can have 10 if you have some intensive agriculture.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman? I guess, yeah, there's some, well, first of all, I agree with the viable agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that the body that can approve that is the Ag Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Give us some feedback on that would be the Ag Commission.
It would essentially, we would ask for a recommendation and a verification, and then as part of the process, we would present that to you.
Right. And so I think that's very valuable. I guess we would want to, as far as the conflicts with existing contracts, what you said there, I think we need to verify that. If there is, because I think some of the people on the commission probably think that it would be better if they have a contract, make it easier on them in making their determination. And I guess the other thing where there's, seems to me a pretty big difference of opinion, maybe, and one of them is like, what does supplement mean? Does it supplement the agricultural operation? And in some views, supplement would mean if you sell mandarins and you can have events on your event center that support your mandarin farm. And that would be a very restrictive definition. And another definition that I think for me means more is if you have 40-acre parcel and you're in a bona fide agricultural operation and you're only making $4,500 a year, then if you had the opportunity to put in an event center on your property and make income off your property that supplements the fact that you have a 40-acre parcel that you're keeping in agriculture, then that would be a desirable feature. And so, to me, that's what supplement should mean.
Right, and I understand and that is a key question with regard to that. That was also in here is you establish a baseline for a verifiable ag use. The next question that comes up, if they're allowed a certain amount of events with a verifiable ag use, did you want those events tied back directly to the ag? Like, if you were a winery, it would be like a harvest festival party? Or do you simply want to go with, you're allowed a certain amount of events and you have a certain amount of improvements, and those events don't necessarily have a requirement to be like a harvest festival or, blessing of the vines or mandarin juicing or something. So that it's a central question. Once you get past, you need a verifiable ag use. If that ag use is going on, most farmers would argue that simply having people come on my property and see my production and what I do is a good thing, and that it doesn't matter whether it's a birthday party, a wedding, or some family reunion, versus it doesn't need to be directly related like a harvest festival or something. So that's really a central question that I would need direction on.
So would it be possible then to have, in this case, an agricultural event center that has a standard of, to become an agricultural event center, it has to pass through the Ag Commission and everybody says yes, and that if they wanted to have unlimited amount of events there dealing with agricultural, that's fine, but if they have something like a wedding, they're limited to 6 a year or something like that. So it could be written in as a standard. And
we can tier it that way. If it's directly related to an agricultural use, you can have unlimited. If it's not directly related to agricultural uses, you get a certain amount. You can do it's
a tiered system.
Yeah, you can do it either way. The real question is do you want the events, once you have a verifiable ag use, do you want the events that take place to absolutely tie back to the ag use, or can they be any kind of event that simply takes place in an agricultural area? And that's the central question that comes up over and over with regard to wineries. And when we get back to the winery ordinance, that is going to be a central question. Some of the vintners would say it needs to be related to the wine industry. Some would say no. So it's a central question.
Okay. Bear that in mind.
I think the State Department of Agricultural has a use or a definition for what they call a bona fide agricultural operation, and it relates more to following best management practices than it does profitability, which might, have us keep us out of the books of the agricultural users.
Right.
But and I think that's something that our agricultural commissioner looks at also is more, are you following best management practices as dictated by the Department of Agriculture, as opposed to whether you're making any money at it or not.
Okay.
And just like keeping out of the books, I don't know how you're going to get in the middle of attending every one of these events and finding out if it's agricultural based or not. I think that just is going to create another point of contention. And is it enough related to the if you serve beef at a cattle ranch, is that agricultural related, or are we just
I would not disagree.
Making a pass here at compliance?
From a staff perspective, it is an easier thing to regulate if you look at the land use impact and regulate it based on the impact that it would have. For instance, an agricultural event center is allowed to have 26 events. Let's just say, just 50, whatever the number turns out to be. And then you regulate it based on the number of events, the amount of people, and that sort of thing.
Noise,
and you don't you don't so much get into the minutia of whether it needs to be connected to the ag use per se, like a harvest festival or something. It's just you're allowed this amount of events. You've addressed the ag component, you have it. You're allowed this amount of events, and you've addressed it through this type of land use improvements.
And to me, that makes more sense. We already have enforcement issues that can't be addressed because of timing and lack of staffing and whatever else. Whether or not it's an agricultural related party is going to be another one of those.
And we have the argument with the winery ordinance all the time. Someone will come in and say, I'm serving wine at this gathering, and but it's for a fundraiser for this. Is that related? And you're like, maybe. I'll get back to you.
Depends what kind of mood
Right.
you're in at the time. You know?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I think
Moving on.
I don't know if we gave you an answer there, but.
I did. No, actually, I think I have enough. I felt pretty confident after the last meeting.
Yeah.
I'm much more confident about the direction you want to go in. I think staff can take this information with regard to amounts of events and that sort of thing and put something together that may not be perfect, but it'll be very close to what we're talking about, and then we can change it from there.
Can I just ask a quick question on that before you move on? Then, in case I missed it, are you saying that you're kind of going in the direction of a 10-acre size and 4,500 in revenue? Is that kind of where you're going?
That would be the direction that I've heard so far. Right. I haven't heard anyone tell me that that's not appropriate.
No, I think that's a good measuring.
Okay.
Good measurement from me.
And then directly related is hours of operations. 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. is clearly the most common time frame I've come across in all 11 counties. I will tell you that the next most common one that I came across was a cutoff between 7 and 8 p.m. in the agricultural areas. Again, highly subjective. No one can tell you why, other than the decision makers in their county thought it was appropriate that these things go to 10 p.m., and then in some other counties they thought it was better that they cut off at 7. So, highly subjective. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, does any of the other counties have these time requirements dependent on, for example, as Gary, Mr. Moss was saying, if the item or the event is inside and there's no external noise going on, are you allowed to have it later? However, if it's outside, they cut it off earlier?
Only one county that I came across, and I don't remember which one, had a sliding scale like that. One, they would let you go to 10 or 11 with indoor, and then if it was exterior, you were cut off at 7. So depending on what we decide to do with noise when we get there, would also be dependent on probably a time frame.
Is this a time frame for both in a commercial event center, commercial zone, or
No.
is this purely agricultural?
This is, I should have defined that. This would be agricultural event centers. And it might, and if the commission wanted, they could also apply this to the actual community center, a time frame on community centers, because that goes in a very broad range of zone districts. Probably doesn't really need to be on commercial event centers, because those things are meant to operate 24 hours. So mostly agricultural event centers, possibly community centers.
Well, what if they wanted to have a pancake breakfast at a community center? Probably before 10 a.m.
That's a good point. I hadn't actually thought about that.
And
Scratch
probably
community
done
centers.
before 10.
We want to have the 10 to 10 apply there. I hadn't thought of the whole pancake. But it does take me back to the original. Community centers probably just need to be regulated strictly because of their uniqueness through the use permit. So I've revised my opinion. This should probably only apply to the agricultural event center.
Yeah,
Right. Okay.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Okay. So noted.
One comment I would make, when you say 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. and then some counties say 7 or 8 p.m.
Yeah.
I think that maybe it could be a blend where if it's a weekday, it might be an earlier cutoff, but if it's a weekend, I mean, you just don't want to blanket, say, 7 o'clock on a Friday or Saturday night when your neighbor that maybe would have the complaint with you is
has all music turned up till 11 o'clock.
So maybe like something like Friday and Saturday to 10 p.m., Sunday through Thursday, cut off at 7 or 8, something like that maybe?
I think that's, I would know, yeah.
Okay.
It'd be worth throwing that out, yeah. What did you say,
Something to work
Friday?
with, some stuff.
So Friday, Saturday, you could go to 10 p.m., and then the rest of the week, the other 5 days, 7 or 8, 7? People have work in this?
Say 8. I'd say 8.
8? Okay. Noise. This is the biggie. So there's been a lot of discussion about how to control noise. I would say this is probably, and this is to do with agricultural event centers. Commercial event centers, not an issue with noise, will be addressed. Community centers addressed through the use permit. But agricultural event centers, truly the one issue that surfaces all the time is probably, well, the two, traffic and noise.
And lights.
So there's a couple ways you can do it. One, depending on how you want to look at it, you can require all agricultural event centers to have events indoors. That's one way. You could require that they are allowed to have outdoor events Friday, Saturday, up to 7 p.m. That's another way that you could do it. You can simply say that they're required to meet the standards in the noise ordinance. I will tell you, in all the research that I have done, this is the single most contentious item that comes up, noise, even more so than traffic. Because traffic, there's generally a fix or a regulation that you can put in to control it. Noise tends to be an issue of, even if you meet a sound standard like our county sound standard, as the night gets later and later, noise tends to become more irritating to people. So if you go out on your deck at 9 p.m. and you hear music or even loud talking, that tends to be extremely irritating to people, especially in rural areas. Even though it may, on a scale of decibels, be below what our county noise ordinance has. So that is something that truly staff would like direction on how you would like that handled. There's basically 3 ways. Keep it all inside. Decide that some noise is going to be acceptable in these areas at a certain level. You could do, if there's going to be outside noise, that it has to be cut off by a certain time at night. All those things. And that is something that staff would definitely like an opinion and direction on.
It seems like one way to deal with that would be to have all late night noise indoors. Number
Right.
one. That would solve one problem. And then other noises to be maybe at 8 o'clock or I don't know, whatever the right hour.
Sometimes they go like sunset, no amplified noise after sunset.
Outdoor amplified noise. Yeah, if a guy's got some little lady sitting there playing a guitar very softly, it's not going to offend anybody. But if you've got a PA system blasting.
My experience tells me that soft guitar outside might be offensive. I'm only giving you what I know from having received calls from people. Depending on the time of day, depending on the weather conditions. If it's during the day, you might not hear the guitar. But if someone is singing a ballad at 9 and you're trying to sleep, it could seem loud.
What were you saying, Ken, about basically you can be indoors or outdoors to a certain time, and anything past that you have to be inside?
Yeah,
period?
That's what I'm saying, just
we
a
could
sunset where it's easy
That's what I
enough
was
to
getting
move
at,
it in.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's another way we could definitely look at noise. Up to sunset defined, I guess we'd have to actually,
It'd
sunset.
have to change every day.
Sunset does change every day, actually.
I would
Probably,
regular
probably
time.
need to pick a time and stick with it.
I would appreciate picking a
8 o'clock or
time.
7:30 or something, and
Knowing the
for standard at least to
controversy
start with.
sunrises,
What?
causes in the
Some standard.
Yeah, definitive
Okay.
standard for outside allowable, and then inside only until whatever hour we showed
Yeah,
it
and-
So-
and
closes the
just-
event.
And
one more comment on that. That's the amplified music. I know for myself, I've had it, and I'm sure people in the audience have had it, and you commented on it, where somebody can be out on their deck talking, and just because of the way the noise flows, that is something I don't think we can regulate. I mean, if you have a certain number of people on a property and they're out there talking, unless they're screaming or yelling, but if they're talking and you just happen to be the neighbor where the sound flows, we can't control that, and it can be irritating, I think.
Right, that's why you have the time cutoff for that too.
Yeah. Well, we've got restrictions for
Well,
how
but
close
you know,
something
like
can be
outside.
to the property line, plus the time cutoff. I don't know if we can go much further.
So essentially, what I'm hearing is you'd like to probably allow some outdoor type sound up generally during daylight hours, generally, not much into the nighttime. After that, any kind of amplified music would be inside.
Any kind of music.
Any kind of.
Yeah, if we start trying to distinguish
Okay.
between how loud somebody unamplified and amplified is, I think we're into a real code enforcement problem. Everybody will have to start showing there. So if we make well, as a suggestion, you might make a hard and fast rule, music amplified or not, indoors after 8, outside before 8.
You could also, instead of not just music, you could require all outdoor activity after a certain time be moved inside. That would also be a way to handle
I
it.
think the whole event going inside after a certain hour is probably.
No, man, it's like, 400 degrees outside, and there's no air conditioning in this building. I want to sit outside and talk. I don't need to yell and bother somebody, but I mean, if we take the events, huge events on 40 acres, why would everybody have to go inside? I mean, the music stopped, not, being broadcast or anything like that, and I'm assuming music would also go, anything amplified. I mean, if somebody's on a loudspeaker talking,
right,
as Ken's pointing out, that's not going to be allowed either.
Okay. So I generally see the direction you'd like to go in, and I think we've gotten enough. That
Say, George.
Yes. You sounded like Michael Johnson.
With me, I'm thinking,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh. Sorry about that.
No. Don't go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you were having a little concern with sunset. To me, I don't have a problem with that because most people can view that it's dark outside now.
Right.
And so, to me, that sunset would be a better than setting an 8 o'clock hour.
Right. I will look at possible alternatives, and maybe I could give you, when I come back with a proposed ordinance, a couple of ideas about what you could put in there as a
Yeah, because that's a hard one. I know that the highway patrol and everyone have a real problem. Turn on your lights at dusk. It's a real hard thing for people to judge.
Daylight, because during the summer, it's going to be later, but then everybody's up. And then if it's midwinter, well.
I don't know, man. I mean, I go to bed at, in summertime to get up to go to work. It's, still light out practically in the middle of June. I'm just saying that for code enforcement, it's just tough. Sunset and sunlight, just with anyway, enough said on that.
It's different when you're on the top of the hill versus when you're in the bowl,
I'll tell you what.
Put them both in there.
What I'll try to bring back is I will look at all the sunset times, generally speaking, during outdoor periods of time, like let's say the summertime when it would be an issue, and I'll pick something for your approval, something sort of midway.
Right,
so, there's a variation of about 45 minutes to an hour.
I thought you meant sunset in Hawaii.
Unfortunately, I don't have to regulate. That doesn't need to be regulated.
We're talking about Placer County here.
Right.
Get back to Placer County.
Yeah, I still.
Let's keep it simple.
Yeah, we'll go
I think if you say sunset or darkness or whatever, I mean, I think what it's really saying is it's dark, then you should be inside.
Right.
And so on this issue, if you put that standard in there, it seems like code enforcement, to say it's 8:01 or 7:35, I'd rather see it be sunset.
Okay.
You put them both in.
I'll bring back a couple ideas, and then
I'm
you can
against
choose.
sunset.
Okay.
I wanted a fine line.
I want moonrise.
The next is access issues. There's really only a couple issues. Either one is, do you want to make a requirement that agricultural event centers be accessed onto publicly maintained right-of-ways?
Yes.
And If you choose not to do that, if you want them to be able to be accessed on privately maintained roadways, then we probably need to write a condition that says you at least need to come up to California fire safe standards through the use permit process to make that road appropriate for your event use. So we'd have to have standards that, like, if you're going to have 100 people, this is the basic standard you will need to meet.
What about the impact to the neighbors on that private road?
Well, that's a different question. We'll get to that one in a second. Let's just answer this first one.
Well, hopefully what would happen is the impact to the neighbors would be greatly lessened if you make them do the appropriate amount of road improvements to improve the private road. If they have the right to use a private road, and they put in the appropriate amount of parking, they put in the appropriate encroachment, they widen the road, they put in appropriate fire turnouts, that will greatly reduce any impacts to the neighbors. The impact that the people may not appreciate is they might like their 10-foot, chip seal road, and they don't want it changed. That's the flip side. I mean, we can address from a land use standpoint, we can take care of, in most instances, the actual health, life, and safety issue. The real question becomes the more nebulous one about what happens about people who don't want essentially a 22-foot wide paved road with turnouts
going through their yard,
going through their property.
Right, but if there's a joint easement where there's 5 people on a road,
right,
and that easement's 20 feet wide, 40 feet wide,
Mhm.
the road is 10 feet wide,
Mhm.
then even if the neighbors wanted to maintain that 10 feet, but any one of the people that have rights to that easement, at their own expense, if they came in and said, look, neighbors, I'm going to improve it and go from the chip seal to a 4-inch, road that's 20 feet wide and everything, because I need to or
Mhm.
whatever for mine. Don't they have the right to do that? I mean,
Yes.
I guess I just can't see them using
Economic decision.
thing saying that I know it's 40 feet wide and
Mhm.
it's 10 feet and
Mhm.
just to stop you from enjoying your property, your 40 or 80 acres at the end of the road,
Mhm.
you can't do that.
You're absolutely right. If you have a 40-foot easement to your property, across other people's property, out to a publicly maintained road, you, in most instances, have the right to improve that 40-foot to the standard that you think is appropriate for your use. There could be an argument about overburdening an easement based on what it was originally intended for. It's a nebulous argument.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you are correct. So that goes back to my point. If you want to allow them to be accessed from private roadways, you probably want to make sure that the roadway can be improved to a certain standard to preserve health, life, and safety at a minimum. Which, if you have 100 people or 200 people coming to an event, that's a fairly substantial road. It's probably going to be a sort of a hybrid between a commercial type road and like a parcel map road. It's probably going to be 18 feet. I talked to engineering and surveying about it, probably about 2 9-foot aisles, couple shoulders, depending on how far back it goes, some turnouts, maybe a cul-de-sac at the end. So if they're going to go on private roads, you may wish to consider having us institute a standard.
Well, George, didn't one of the counties require that if it was going to be on a private road, that they had to get the approval of all the property owners that were impacted on that roadway?
They did, but there's a second half to that. In that county, and I believe it was Amador County, and I think I saw the requirement in one other county, it was if you're going to use a private road, you either have to get the approval of all the property owners, and if you can't, then you have to come in for a use permit. And when you came in for the use permit, then the county would have the right to regulate through the use permit process the improvement necessary for that road. So in this instance, if agricultural event centers are going to be required to obtain a use permit, it sort of negates that unless that's something that you would want to pursue. It's like you need approval from all the property owners, and then you need to get a use permit. That's a tough thing, though. I mean,
Well, I guess I have a question, because what I'm hearing you saying, if a person went to all of his neighbors and it's, maybe the minimum is 10 feet for fire, and 50 or 12 feet, and
Okay.
the road sort of meets that, but if all the neighbors come up and he's got a letter and submits it to you and says, look, we don't care.
Mm-hmm.
He's allowed 25 events, 50 events, and it's 100 people, that we don't have a problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
But if they don't agree to it, then it comes back to the county and Commodore. Then they set the conditions of that roadway, and it bypasses the people. I guess that's what I'm thinking is. I mean, in my mind, I could probably see that as part of it, you know, a deal, but I think they would end up having to do road improvements.
My concern with if you're going to allow an event center on a private road, my concern is if you're going to issue a use permit to do that, if you don't make that road meet a minimum life and safety standard, then the county is in a liable position. So regardless, we as a county would have to do something. You can't allow 400 people to go up a 10-foot wide road 600 feet. I mean, because if someone has a heart attack, a fire, people just simply can't access that.
Well, and actually, my thinking would be that the improvements would have to go in.
Right.
I know the argument is from the neighbors, well, you don't have the right to do it because you're accessing mine and, you know, in front of my property. And if it's an easement and they can meet the improvements for the 600 feet or whatever, that lets you know if the person that's putting in the event center at the end, that they're willing to.
And it does go back to the original fragmentation issue that we were discussing previously. A lot of these agricultural event centers, a lot of these agricultural uses are going to be on private roads because of the way our county has been broken up. A lot of the other counties, they have large pieces of land that front on county-maintained roads. That is not the case in Placer County. I would say the majority of these things may not front on county roads. So it's fine if you don't want to allow them to be accessed on private roads. But a lot of the proposals, I think, will come from that area. So it's a matter of deciding. Private roads, public roads.
Okay.
I don't think we want to defeat the purpose here, though. If we're trying to supplement agriculture that's having a hard time to survive, to tell them they got to put in $500,000 worth of road improvements so they can have 20 events a year, kind of defeats the.
Well, I think you're right, and
You can do it, but we're going to make it impossible to have.
Well, the question becomes, are they going to have 20 events for which they just need approval, or are they going to have a center that's going to be used? If they're going to develop an entire event center, then I think, yes, then they have to develop the standard. If they're just going to have a few events, then it's different. That would be the way I would look at it.
I think the whole issue here of having these big improvements, like Mr. Moss said, is that we're driving the wrong behavior. Are we trying to keep agricultural uses and agricultural zoning, or are we going to put commercial event centers at the end of a private road? Because they do put a lot of improvements, and they're going to have to have a ton of events, and it's not going to be supplemental agricultural. It'll be a community event center in an agricultural area, period.
You see the lot split.
So there's a balance there, you know, to make an improvement or to allow basically a commercial enterprise that's not connected to agriculture. I mean, we may be driving the wrong behavior by having that many private roads improved to whatever standards, although I agree with what you said about the county liability and all that, but I think that's a tricky issue.
I think the minimum that the county probably should consider on a private road would be California Fire Safe Standards, which I put in my staff report. That's to preserve health, life, and safety. That would be the minimum standard. It's not a tiny standard. It's not huge, but it's not tiny. I think if you're inclined to do a private road scenario, you would probably need to consider some kind of improvement with the starting point being California Safe Fire Standards.
That's probably true.
And that's going to be expensive for them to meet, even that minimum. So I think we're almost forcing them to go back to point one up here, which is public right-of-way access. Because I think it's not feasible otherwise, probably, for most of these operations.
Well, it might not be feasible, but it should be allowed if they can meet it.
Yeah,
Just as far as a legal, fairness issue, but.
Yeah, if they're willing to throw their money at it, then they guess they can.
Yeah, if somebody has an easement and they look at the rest of the criteria and come forward with a conditional use permit, and they have to meet the fire standards for the access, and why would we say no at that point unless they can't meet some other standard or their proposal's not very sound?
Yeah, and I understand the point. I need direction from you as a commission about if you'd like to go in the only publicly accessed roadway, or if you would like me to pursue the allowing them on private roadways with the minimum standard being fire safe standards.
I vote that one.
Yeah.
I think otherwise we're not only that, but we're being unfair to people who just don't happen to live in the right spot.
No problem.
They can meet our criteria.
Fire safe.
Should be looked at.
Okay.
Does that sound right, Board?
Yep.
Right. Okay.
Right, boss?
Go ahead.
Parking issues. One of the newer issues that came up during the workshop was that there was concern that to make sure that the on-site use that was proposed had appropriate amounts of parking. The standard, which is pretty universal, is one parking space per 2.5 guests. Okay, so that means one parking space per 2.5 guests, depending on what your maximum size is. So if your maximum size is 100, you need 40 parking spaces, and then it's one per permanent employee. That is a fairly standard across the board standard. I will tell you our current standard is 1 per 40 square foot of multi-purpose floor area, which is, in my experience, slightly less than the 2.5 and not enough. 2.5, and I've figured it out and I've thought about it, about events, it is the right number. I mean, it works out about right. 2 is too many, 3 is not quite enough, 2.5, and you take into account employee parking, I think it covers it.
It seems like if you're talking about the community commercial event centers and even the community centers, you should have the higher standard.
Yeah, I think.
And you'd have to have the improved standard. Now, I could even, if you were only going to have a small amount of events, you could have the parking be a gravel parking in the agriculture. So I think there's maybe different standards for different events.
What I would tell you is the surfacing standards could change, but the actual amount of space necessary for parking is probably the more critical issue. For in other words, if you're going to have 10 events a year and you're in an agricultural zone district, we very well could look at things like maybe a gravel parking area. However, we should probably still maintain that 2.5 to 1 ratio.
I agree with that. And I think the other reason is that if, for whatever reason, that no longer is an agricultural event center, you can disc it up and plant corn or something.
Yeah, it makes good sense maybe in some of these agricultural areas not to have surfacing.
Yeah, I think this is a good standard. I don't like the 40 square feet. I think there's more, you can pack more people than 2.5 people in 40 square feet.
Yeah.
So, I think this is a better way to measure it. The one thing that I was going to mention, George, is last time I brought this up, because people will park where they want to park.
Right.
It really needs to be enforcement that they do not park on the access roads or the public roads, because people are going to do that, and that just impedes the potential of emergency vehicles. So I don't know how you want to address that, but that's something that I'm a little sensitive to.
I would tell you, Commissioner Nader, the best way to address it, in my experience as a planner for a long time, is to make sure that there's adequate, appropriate parking on site, and people will go for it every time. You make it easy, you make it accessible, people can get in and out of that parking, and it's close to the event center. That's the very best way. Instead of trying to enforce it, make it so people want to park on the on-site parking and not go outside. So enough parking spaces, good ingress and egress, in and out, you will never have people anywhere but in that parking lot.
So you don't think it's necessary to stipulate that there will be no off-site parking?
No, we can absolutely stipulate no off-site parking. But even if we stipulate it in the ordinance, if we don't take care of it on-site, people will do it anyways.
I agree.
So that's, yes, we should stipulate no off-site parking unless it's in a verified, another verified parking lot through the use permit, like an off-site with a shuttle
Right, they want to have
service.
shuttle.
Right. But, yeah, definitely, but the way to make sure that it's never an enforcement issue is by making the parking on-site adequate and appropriate.
And in a good location, appropriate, I guess is the right.
Yes,
yeah.
easy
Because-
access, people will go there every time,
Yeah.
like parking in front of the grocery store. Every time if you can park, that's where you go.
Okay.
How come they have this?
Moving on. Moving on.
All right, we've already gone on-site agricultural, on-site security. Of the 11 counties I surveyed, virtually no one has any requirement for on-site security if alcohol is served. Monterey County has some standards if security is needed with regard to using deputy sheriffs or certified security guards. So that's really a question, do you want to pursue that, or do you just want to leave it up to an individual?
Yeah, I would leave it up to the individual, that they have to control the alcohol.
Well, alcohol consumption in the end is, limited by the person himself, If he's going to drink and get in the car, it doesn't matter
Right.
what event, where he's at.
We don't need to deal with it.
Yeah, so move on
Okay.
from this one.
Right.
Lighting, agricultural event centers, last time I thought it was well received that any agricultural event center would be dark sky compliant. And then the rest of the event centers and community centers, commercial event centers would be subject to our guidelines, which have pretty stringent lighting guidelines. We could even beef up agricultural event center guidelines by putting in some more language about dark sky compliant. Everything has to be shielded downward so it doesn't leave the site, low glare, that sort of thing, minimize the lighting.
I'm good with that.
Small candles only.
Okay. Food guidelines. This was another issue that came up.
Oh, my God. Food, what time is it?
There are several ways to handle this. You could make food service should be clearly subordinate to the on-site agricultural use. You could make food service limited to catered foods or mobile food vendors. Then the big question is can an agricultural event center have a commercial kitchen, or should it be limited to on-site catered events?
I guess my comment on that, it would be if somebody's putting in a commercial kitchen and has to meet all the standards, and they're gonna only be doing 25 events a year, it's gonna be up to them.
Okay.
It shouldn't be a restaurant. I know you
No,
know.
and I'm not saying restaurant.
No, I'm not
I mean,
saying you
just
are,
just this, because if it's just for the events, and then all of a sudden, I think that would be well-known right off the bat by the neighbors, if all of a sudden, there's people coming and they see a sign up there, our daily special is the Joe's Restaurant.
So essentially what I'm hearing is you would like, you don't necessarily have a problem with a commercial kitchen, but you would like language crafted so that it does not become a restaurant type use.
It can only be used for an event.
Like
For that
clearly,
event
clearly
center.
subordinate to the event center and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if they're limited to, whatever that limit is, because that would make it real quick if it's a small number of events that they would automatically go to a catered or a mobile food.
Okay, we'll come back with that. The good news is this is the last one I have for you. Should event centers and agricultural zone districts be required to be a minimum distance from each other? I can find virtually, I'll tell you what I found, virtually no one does this. The only county that had any requirement for a density limitation based on distance was Monterey County, and they handled that through, in a small geographical area, well not so small, but a geographical area that was done in a specific plan where all the infrastructure was analyzed, the roads were analyzed, the access was analyzed. It's a very, very tightly controlled area where they said, okay, you can have this many eating establishments on this much roadway and that sort of thing. It would be an extremely hard standard without a lot of study across the entire county to impose in an impartial manner.
I could see where you could have a winery next to each other, you could have mandarin orchards next to each other.
Mhm.
So your suggestion of a half mile, you just threw it out as an
Right.
idea, having a half mile distance between them, I don't think that's really practical.
Right. I think it might be something better handled through the use permit when you look at these things. Is it appropriate? You look at the event center and you have to make a finding. Does it endanger the health, safety, general welfare of surrounding property owners? That is one way that you have to address this issue, instead of trying to figure out what an appropriate distance is.
What about encouraging joint ventures too, between maybe two farmers that are 200 yards apart, each of them having one that get together and do it, Have one between them.
We could look at that through the use permit. Probably more than receptive to that.
Okay.
Okay, George.
That was the last issue. The one issue that I didn't put up here is the code enforcement issue. I think we've talked about that enough. I know that you are very much in favor of making sure that whatever ordinance we have, that it is enforceable, and that we have the ability to enforce it quickly and efficiently.
Well, would one of the
things, George,
one of the
that we-
concepts be that no matter what we approve here within either special events or community events, that there's a 2-year moratorium on them returning to have that approved again to make sure that none of these problems arise from the first sets that we looked up, or
That is one thing
possible?
that is one thing that we could propose, that you could propose as part of the ordinance, that there's a 2-year probationary period. The one other unique thing that might be something that you might want to think about with regard to enforcement is that every agricultural event center has to have a contact person that people are aware of that can be contacted during events if there's an issue. Sort of like if you are AA Ranch Event Center and Mandarin Farm, that when you have one of your 26 events, that there's a phone number that people know about, that they can go, hey, look, it's 10 o'clock and you were supposed to be done at 8 and it's like really loud. Can you tell me what's happening? That's another thing you might want to think about. So it's an idea. I don't know if you want to consider that or not.
Well, I certainly do, because, some people would want to just rely on talking to you at the county. And it really does, if there is some text in there that encourages the event center owner to publish a schedule, or to have a person that neighbors know they can notify,
or both,
then self-enforcement is
right.
Actually probably more effective than hoping to have a copy.
I mean, the requirement could be something like, before you have an event, you post in a conspicuous area contact information, like at the end of your driveway or your event. Somewhere where people that drive by in the neighborhood, and it says, we're having an event on this date from this time. If you have an issue or a problem, feel free to contact this number.
That's a good idea.
We could do something
do that,
like that
like
as well.
and posting either online or phone number, or
Yeah.
combination of
All sorts of things.
Yeah.
George, you said you didn't want to talk about enforcement?
No. I said I
think
we've gone over it quite a bit. If you'd like to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, you made 4 sort of suggestions in here. I was going to say one I'm not sure is practical.
Which one is that?
It's on page 10. You have 4 sort of suggested things in there. Again, I don't know that the Sheriff's Department is really geared up to try to deal with some of these issues. There's got to be other ways to do it, but I was just going to say that I really liked, I highlighted both 3 and 4, because I like the county having a really heavy, big hammer over these folks.
Okay.
And I like the idea of a misdemeanor with the district attorney. And I like the idea of them also at risk of, revoking their condition, conditional use permit. So that's just for me. I really want the county to have a pretty hard way to come down on these folks if they're in violation.
Okay. The reason the Sheriff's Department personnel was put in the code enforcement, because they're actually written into our noise ordinance as the first responders on noise complaints. When I go back, and I'll look at some alternatives to bring back to you, maybe in conjunction with the Sheriff's Department and some other things of that nature.
Have you had discussions with them about that?
We do have discussions with them about noise complaints. it would be something that we need to have further discussions with them about.
Because they don't carry the thing, do they, that picks up the noise?
They're supposed to.
They're supposed to, okay.
They're supposed to
all have one, or?
Dude, what was that?
Are they supposed to all have one? I mean, all the patrol cars have?
When the noise ordinance was originally adopted about 15 years ago, we bought two meters that the sheriff's department is supposed to have, that they're supposed to be first responders with.
Behind the door in the men's room units.
They may or may not have access to them right now. So we've been having ongoing discussions about how to restart that.
You know, George, just a statement. To me, one of the advantages that we're going through here with a permit, a conditional use permit, is the fact that, you know, people that normally would have regular parties go through the process and have conditions that they can be held accountable for.
Right.
And so that makes this process pretty desirable, I think, in the big picture. Sometimes, you know, maybe it's the people that are the violators are the ones that don't go through the permit process.
Right.
And so here we have people that are actually going through the process and agreeing to the conditions.
Yeah, and the other good thing about this would be if we're able to come up with a much better enforcement process, it will help us with the people who don't go through the process as well.
Correct.
To be much more proactive. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You're over here.
Good job.
Don't go far. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to open up the public hearing, and before anybody comes up, I should like to ask, first of all, how many people here would like to speak? Just about everybody here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is ask a couple of things. One, if you could, confine your comments to parts of the discussion that we haven't already covered, if you've got a particular view on something in special. And I'm going to ask to keep the comments to about 3 to 4 minutes, if you would. All right? First, please enter and sign in. And give us your name.
There is no sign-in sheet.
Okay, well then just...
I can make one. I really can. I'm Patricia Burke, 1700 Country Hill Run, Newcastle, California. And on behalf of the over 100 members of Safe Placer Farmlands, Susan Ames, Lori Lewis, and I would like to, with your permission, give our 3 minutes each to Carol Rubin so that she can make a presentation on which we all agree. Thank you.
Okay, could you, the people she mentioned, raise your hand?
Yes.
Those four? You and, okay.
Carol Rubin is on the end, and then Lori and Sue are.
All right, Carol.
You want me up next?
Let's have it.
Step in front of the firing squad here?
Not at all. So we're your friends and admirers here.
I want to thank my colleagues in Safe Placer Farmlands for giving me this opportunity to speak on their behalf, and I want to once again thank the Board of Supervisors for permitting this moratorium process, and for you folks on the Planning Commission and the planning staff for making this a productive series of workshops. And I have to say, I had 10 minutes of remarks, all carefully written out, and between your discussion and what Mr. Rosasco has said, that's been blown completely out of the water. So I apologize for the more fragmented set in this discussion. I think what I really would like to start with is that we have a need here for modifications in both the policy and the process on this community center issue. And I know you've all read my document that I submitted thoroughly, right? So I'm not going to try and hit anything except what I think are the most important issues. The new definitions proposed by the planning staff are a great start, but we believe there needs to be at least one more category. I think, as some of you have alluded, Placer County should make it relatively easy for an ag producer to have a few promotional events that don't require a permanent facility, similar to temporary outdoor events. And we suggest that about 8 events, for example, if a pumpkin producer wanted to hold some seasonal Halloween parties of no more than 50 persons each, held in a a tent or other temporary structure that doesn't require a dedicated water or sewer system, people should be able to have a fairly easy way of getting a permit to do that. Let's make it easy for them to do the simple things. We like the CUP approval process proposed by staff for the event centers in ag zoning, but we really think that there are additional explicit conditions on the location and operation of these facilities that need to be added. And we've proposed these before. I noticed that the commissioners mentioned a notion of fairness with regards to access, and I hope we can reconsider that. We're already making the process unfair. I'm on 5 acres. I'm not allowed to have these things at all. Okay, it's already unfair. But what we need to do is make a way so that people who might want to have an event center because they're going to be a winery or something know ahead of time when they purchase a parcel what's going to be allowed on it. And what we'd like to suggest is that we need some access standards based on the size and the probable impact of these centers. In my opinion, allowing these things on shared access roadways is asking for lawsuits. I mean, you're just setting up bad blood between neighbors. The large centers should have to have access from a highway or a freeway. The intermediate centers should have to have access from an arterial roadway or better. You want to have a small center, 100 or less on 10 acres, maybe a rural collector is adequate. But let's put it right in the code what the access requirements are, and let's make them match the size and the probable impact of the events. We'd also ask that you consider requiring that these event centers, not the temporary events held by a farmer seasonally, but the event centers be located within 3 miles of a city limits or within 1 mile of property that's zoned industrial or commercial. These things have been characterized by county staff in one of the mitigated negative declarations as suburban uses. And we want to keep them out of the real rural areas of the county, I think. We want to keep them in the suburbanized areas, those areas that are already near towns or already have industrial commercial zoning near them. I think that represents a nice compromise. We'd also ask that perhaps you consider not allowing event centers within 1 mile of an endangered species habitat or a salmon spawning stream. That might not be an appropriate mix in a rural area. We note that facility size was not addressed in the staff comments. I think this should be something that should be in the zoning, and that small event centers, for instance, should be limited to 3,000 square feet or less. Intermediate centers you might want to limit to 5,000 square feet or less. Again, you just want to let people know up front what they can expect, what they're going to be able to do when they file their application. Staff has noted in the past, and we agree, that the Newcastle Wedding Gardens and the Flower Farm appear to be well tolerated in their neighborhoods. That's because they're on arterial roadways in suburban locations. We also believe these well-considered locations are one reason these 2 facilities have been successful. They are where their customers can get to them. And we think Placer County should be promoting locations of these businesses in areas where they're likely to succeed. Stating these conditions explicitly in the code is going to remove the ambiguity that frustrates both us, the rural Placer residents, and the applicants. And you've heard both the Wise Villa and the Gold Hill Gardens applicants complain of the multi-year, uncertain, expensive approval process that they're going through now, and the perception that the requirements are changing constantly. Explicit, clear, simple standards will mean that applicants know immediately whether their application is likely to succeed. Applicants who wish to request a minor variance, like for a setback, as was mentioned, would be required to undergo additional steps in scrutiny. And applicants whose facilities deviate in major respects from the standards could be advised immediately that the application's not acceptable. Residents are also going to know immediately whether a particular application falls within the standards, and this is going to lessen these long, drawn-out hearing processes that we all love so much. So this is going to save time, effort, and cost for all the parties. And then, I don't know if you want to discuss this at all. I also have a few specific comments on some of the points raised.
It's within your time period, so you can go ahead and mention it.
Okay, thank you. There was one comment made in the staff report that kind of alarmed us. It says, while residents may have elected to live in farm agricultural areas, the Planning Commission will need to consider whether or not it is appropriate to restrict farm agricultural activities to preserve the environment for residents. This implies these event centers are farm agricultural activities, which might fall under right to farm protections. And we strongly object to this. Weddings, receptions, and conferences are no more farming than a landowner who decides to construct a racetrack and invite his friends over for a weekend of go-kart racing. These uses are additional profit centers that happen to be co-located with an agricultural operation. They're not farming. We hope that the noise complaints would be addressed, as has been mentioned, by increasing the setbacks and adjusting the hours of operation and prohibiting outdoor music. I should note when we talk about outdoor operation, hours of operation, that the discussion has been limited to the activities at the site, but you also have to remember that at 10 o'clock, if you're shutting one of these things down, there's going to be 100 cars or so, people waving goodbye to each other, honking their horns, peeling out as they exit the driveway. And that's a noise consideration, too, even if they've been having the actual event inside, that really is going to drive the people who have to live along those roads crazy. Let's see. I want to talk also about the code enforcement and the density issue. I'm not sure that staff's suggestion the sheriff be the primary code enforcer is the best use of a limited law enforcement resource. And the sheriff doesn't have access to the CUPs and isn't going to know whether a particular facility can even legally have events, let alone whether the operator is having events that are too large or too numerous. We did propose an online event licensing system that some of you have talked about different aspects of, that would make it easy for event center and community center operators to register their events and for Placer residents to learn about events in their areas. And we note that these licenses, which I think it was Mr. Gray said, let's separate the actual physical center from the events held, and that's what this would do, is you'd have your center, but you'd also apply every year for a license to hold a certain number or size of events, just like you apply every year for your NID water. Okay, and if you're a good person and you don't have any sustained complaints against you, then your permit's automatically renewed. If you're less than good, then maybe we have to have a little talk. As was also pointed out, this would give you a way, this online system would give you a way of having issues be resolved directly between the complainant and the facility operator, and code enforcement wouldn't have to get involved at all, which I think everybody would agree is kind of a, an ideal setup. Let's see. If you decide not to adopt that system, I think we would ask, and I am finishing up, that any enforcement system should have the following attributes. It should be accessible 24 hours a day, either by telephone or online, to remove the requirement that complainants come down to the county offices to file a complaint. It should be traceable so that a complainant knows the status and the resolution of their complaint, and it should be accountable. And one other way of doing it, other than selling licenses, is with a bonding process. So that residents and permitted facility operators know what the penalties are for violations and that they are equitably applied. We don't like the enforcement provision number 4 that was mentioned, which is the 2-year probationary period, because quite frankly, if conditions of the approval are violated at any time, not just during the first 2 years, the permit should be able to be suspended or revoked. And I want to note that these kinds of enforcement activities are for the protection also of the legitimate facility operators, the people who are trying to go through all the hoops, because right now there are many more unpermitted events in Placer County than there are permitted ones. And this increases the bitterness. This is why you get so much bitterness between the residents and these operators who are holding these fly-by-night events. And it also damages the reputation of the people who are trying to do it right. So I want to ask you guys to consider these additional stipulations for access and location for the facilities, and also a really robust code enforcement mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Jones. I live in Auburn, California, on Incline Drive. I have a couple of quick questions. You have on page 3 of the handout, you've defined the different zoning levels, C1, C2, residential. But in your community plans, you have mixed use. So an event center in a mixed use area, does it go to the least common denominator or the highest density? That's one question. Will this new ordinance trump the existing minor use permits in these areas? Do they have to reapply? And then lastly, the define indoors. When you say that the events have to be brought indoors, you really haven't given us, is that 4 walls and a door? And, I mean, a definition would be helpful. I've been to a lot of political events and a lot of fun events that are in basically a 3-wall pole bar type thing. So that would be helpful. And then as a matter of information, the management at the Forest House in Forest Hill have downloaded a decibel on their app, on their phone, so they can actually go out and measure the decibels of the noise level outside of the Forest House for the weddings and whatever. So technology is going to help us all document, but it's still going to require a lot of goodwill. And unfortunately, most problems occur on weekends when your code enforcement folks are home enjoying themselves. So those are my questions. Mixed use, how does this apply? Will the ordinance require a trump over the existing minor use and major use permits? And then please define what indoor means. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll give a chance to staff.
I think we'll hear and then go back, or you want to try to do it right now?
It's up to you.
Let's try, because I'm sure council will probably have to chime in on this as far as trumping other things as well.
Mixed use is a land use designation in a plan, which is implemented by a zone district, which is either going to be C1, C2, residential multifamily, something like that. So essentially, mixed use is a land use designation, and then you implement that through zoning designation, which would be one of the ones probably in the commercial districts that are outlined in my staff report.
You know, I didn't get that at all, George.
Okay. So essentially in a community plan or a general plan, you have land use designations, okay? For instance, you would have an agricultural land use designation over agricultural lands. That agricultural land use designation would be implemented by different zoning designations. Like you might have farm 160, farm 40, residential agricultural 4.6.
But they'd all be under agriculture.
All under agricultural. And that's what a mixed use designation is. It gives you some ability to have residential and commercial mixed, but it's not a zoning designation. It's a land use designation implemented by a zone district, which would be covered. And it is conceivable with a use permit, you might be able to have some kind of event center and something designated as a mixed use, depending on what it is. You know, if it's apartments on a 3-story building and the event center is on the bottom level, it might be appropriate. Who knows? That would be something that would be looked at as part of the use permit or design review.
Okay. Any question concerning this ordinance versus a former ordinance?
I didn't understand that question.
Well, the existing permits would, This would not go back and take into account existing permits. They have their approvals. Those approvals will continue in place. Any ordinance that is put in place by the commission and board will affect future applications, not past applications.
And to the extent that the past applications differ with the ordinance that is now adopted, those uses may or may not be considered grandfathered in. They're considered legal non-conforming uses. There's a whole host of provisions regarding that. Essentially, a new ordinance will not make these uses illegal, but they may limit them in terms of what they do in the future.
Legal non-conforming.
And what I would tell you about the sound issue, when we come back with a proposed ordinance and there's a requirement to move it inside, there'll be a standard that says when you move it inside the building, it needs to emit less than, let's say, 5 decibels at 10 foot from the exterior wall. There'll be an appropriate standard that will stop noise from leaving the site. I don't know exactly what that standard is. I have to do some research, but there will be a definable standard when you move inside, how that cuts the noise.
And there will also be a definition of what indoors is.
Yeah.
A pole barn will not be indoors.
Yeah, because you could say enclosed.
Yeah.
Okay. Next person wishing to speak.
Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Donald DuPont. I represent Rock Hill Winery. And I want to thank you all for the reasonable responses I heard. I think that people are kind of going through, trying to feel their way through, since this is such a new issue. At any rate, I'm going to out of order here a little bit, but the contact information that George referred to could be very similar to the ADA requirement when your car gets towed away. There's a posted sign at the gate or at the entrance of the property. So we could do that with a number and a name, as well as the internet, which I heard some of you say. Those are good ways to be able to handle that. Mr. Johnson, I think, approved or liked the idea of an event where sound outside or excessive sound outside might end at sunset. It's probably a good way to do it. I don't think anybody in December wants music till 9 o'clock. On the other hand, summer solstice, the 22nd of June, 8:30 does sound reasonable. Also, please bear in mind, I probably should have brought a copy of this, but maybe County Council could eventually verify this. But the general plan is very specific. It says, in paraphrase this, the county shall not unreasonably interfere with the farmer's right to create supplemental income. That doesn't mean that you can have a full-blown commercial endeavor here, but we're trying to get somewhere in between. I know it's a slippery slope, but somewhere between what is commercial and what is really agricultural. For that reason, I met with Carol Rubin and Jennifer and Pat Burt, and also help me out, Marilyn Jasper, and had a pretty productive meeting. I think they come across with some reasonable ideas. And one thing, for example, when there's a 2-year prohibition, I think that almost sends the wrong signal, because what does that mean? After 2 years, you do what you darn well please, or probably develop some kind of a policy where if you're in repeated violation, that your use permit or your permission to operate should be suspended. And I'm a winery saying this. So, if you're gonna drive your neighbors crazy, you're gonna have to pay the price, especially if you're warned about this. In terms of the decibels of sound, I mentioned this last time. Any of you that want to see my facility, it's terrific. But because it's a winery and it has to be cold inside, we have heavy insulation. So we had an occasion where there's loud music inside, and you step outside, it's completely quiet. So I think those are things that would help as well. Josh recently shared with me an ordinance from San Luis Obispo, which I know you're familiar with, George. And in that ordinance, it said if there's 50 people or more, you can gather any day without restriction. And I think one of the reasons they probably do that, it's too hard to micromanage how many people. I mean, the county's not going to be out there with a counter like Costco counting how many people show up. So that's probably one way to do it. And then events that are larger than 50, then it'd be required to have a certain number of events allowed, whatever they come up with. But anyway, the ordinance that Josh Hunsinger from the Ag Commissioner showed me from San Luis Obispo seemed extremely reasonable. And then last thing, Mr. Moss mentioned something that makes complete sense. In terms of trying to regulate the size of the event center with the size of the property, it's not always going to be consistent, because in some cases you might have a facility that's larger that could accommodate more people inside and maybe perhaps not have exact number of acres. And also, Mr. Nader mentioned that, if you got 9 acres and you're trying to make a 10-acre, it wouldn't be unreasonable to get special permission for that. If you have any questions, I'd appreciate you asking me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Evans, Meadow Vista, Bear River Winery. First, I just wanted to say that I'm a little concerned about, apparently there was some sort of private meeting between some of the key stakeholders here and county staff, and I'm thinking, is this Brown Act or something? But, I'm a little concerned about that. But I'm confused here, and I'm looking for more clarification. It's kind of blurry to me what requirements were really being levied against commercial event centers versus agriculture event centers. And I can understand the sensitivity on agriculture event centers. Commercial event centers, I can't imagine having, 10-acre minimums for them, or 200-foot setbacks, or especially limiting the hours and noise like you guys are talking about. For example, Duffy's Tavern down the street can, have loud disco music inside the bar until 2 o'clock in the morning, and then people get in their cars and, skid out like.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
That wasn't my impression. My impression was that almost
you're just talking
99% of what George said today, I believe, if I'm right, was about agricultural event centers and stuff like that. And the other ones are all been regulated under other ordinances, and like they're allowed by right in commercial, and they have to have the right parking, the right noise ordinances, all the good stuff like that, and the other zoning. But his comments, I believe, and what most of our comments today were strictly on agricultural event center, because that's where the issues have been.
Okay, well, maybe I'm a little bit.
That is correct. The commercial event center, to put your mind at ease, that would be regulated just strictly through our normal ordinance that requires design review, lighting. Hours of operation would be just like any other commercial venue. It would not. 99% of what we talked about was just agricultural event centers.
Okay, I guess the reason I'm concerned is because I think I've mentioned this to you guys before, that when the winery ordinance was passed, my property, which is commercial but it's resort, was left out entirely. And so maybe I'm in a gray area. I'm next to industrial. I'm next to res ag, but I'm resort. So it's a commercial zoning, but it's in between those two areas there. And so I guess the things I'm thinking.
Let me interrupt you again. You mentioned that last week.
Or last month, but
Yeah.
if I don't know what the resort ordinance says, but if it in fact is commercial, then it's covered under whatever you can do in, quote, commercial property. And I don't know, I can't tell you what.
That's what I thought. When you look at the list for a resort, it included a whole bunch of things like, gas station or motel or restaurant, bar, but winery was eliminated from it by the winery ordinance.
I don't know about that.
Mr. Chair, if I might,
Johnson.
as the planning director for the county, I did prepare a planning director's determination with regards to your specific
you
use,
did.
and
But-
found that it was an appropriate use for the resort zoning district.
But now I'm finding myself being regulated as if I was F by the Ag Commissioner because of that letter of determination, because I don't have by right resort a winery. Like Bonitata in downtown Auburn doesn't have to have acres of grapes growing there, but I do, because I have a letter of determination and I don't have, the ability to have a winery in the ordinance, if you can follow that. And I think you're going to boot me here, but I just wanted to say a couple more things really quickly, and that is, when you talk about noise about commercial property, I've got an asphalt plant next to me with 300 trucks a day.
We're not. We're trying to confine ourselves to agricultural event centers right now. So if you respond to us in that regard as opposed to commercial, which
this ordinance is going to cover both commercial event centers and agricultural event centers, both. And right now, if you look at what is allowed on a resort for community centers, which, because there is no event, commercial or agricultural event center currently, there's only community centers. If you look right now for resort, it says basic right, no MUP, no CUP needed. Now, they're going to go past this new ordinance for commercial event centers and agricultural event centers, and George just said a few minutes ago it requires CUP, and you guys were talking about an EIR. Those things are very difficult and expensive to do. And, you know, I'm next to industrial zoning with an asphalt plant and a gravel quarry. Anyway, I just wanted to get that point across and make you think about it, okay? Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you for that input.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is Mike Carson. I reside on 2325 Gold Hill Road. And you know, recently I was approved for a community center. I just had a couple of quick things. If you decide to limit the number of events, I really think you should take into consideration the number of occupancies for the event. So if it's 50 people or less that's allowed in the small, that maybe the number of events could be increased. I think from a noise and impact standpoint, clearly there's the more occupants you have, the more potential for impact. Under the setbacks, I really think you need to be careful about setting a large setback similar to what I think they were talking about, 100 or 200 feet, unless you're going to try to go through and define clearly what component of the event center has to be set back. You want to be careful, you know, from an agricultural use, there shouldn't be any setback, but if it's tied to a community center, then does that ag person not, you know, can they not have their agricultural use close to the property line? You never know what one neighbor might like or not like. So I think you need to be careful and define what components have that setback tied to them. From an enforcement standpoint, I think clearly that that's something that needs to be addressed and should be very straightforward for any of the neighbors or anybody that's within the area. But I also think that it needs to there needs to be provisions for what's being called in and being complained about, whether it's legitimate or not. So there needs to be measures put into place so that the person that's conducting the events, if they're doing the best that they can and they are meeting the letter of the law, that somebody that's complaining out of context isn't a thorn in everybody else's side. And then as far as the noise goes, I went out and bought a noise meter. They're not that expensive. I think that there could be conditions on every single event center that they have to have a noise meter on site. If a neighbor wants to come over and they're complaining, go out there and measure it. It's not hard. They're very easy to use. And I know there are apps also for that. So, and then as far as there might be something looked at as definition of events. You know, if somebody's having, I know Flower Farm does, they have a quilting thing that goes on for 2 or 3 days. Is that considered an event? You know, there's no music, it's not outside, it's, you know, so I think that somebody should look at what is, quote, considered an event. I think that that's only fair. You know, my wife and I plan on trying to do garden tours. We'd like to do charitable event things, but, you know, if you're trying to make supplemental income, you're not going to be able to put on as many charitable things if it's counting into the limited number of events that you can have. So I think that there should be a balance there, and give these businesses an opportunity to give back to the community. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tina Wilkins, Vina Castellano Winery on Bell Road. I feel somewhat encouraged by this process and a little bit fearful because I know what's coming next is the winery ordinance, and I'm a proponent of keeping them separate. But I want to say that my concern is that we need to be careful in the development of the agricultural community center part of this ordinance so that you don't create a scenario where you make it only viable for what are really very commercial projects. If you over-require the commercial element of this, whether it be through building requirements or road requirements, or you can't be on a private road, it won't be viable for the small agricultural producer who's truly trying to just augment an income that's not matching its facility to comply with it. And I'm a classic example. I would like to never have to have anything other than guests coming to my winery Thursday through Sunday, because my home and my family is being raised at that winery. The things that I'm doing are truly to try to supplement my income until such a time that Thursday through Sunday I can stay open and maybe, God willing, someday make a profit, because after 13 years I haven't done that yet. So I'd just like you to keep in mind that, you know, we can't get the cart before the horse. We're still a new developing region, and there's a reason why Amador and El Dorado and Nevada and even Napa had much less regulation in the beginning than they do now. So I'd just like you to bear in mind that sometimes very well-meaning, trying to take care of the neighbors, and I understand how that is. I try to take care of my neighbors a lot, have a good relationship with them, but at the same time, you can get us out of the game. You can set us back to a point where we can't get to the profitability and keep our farms going. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to mention right now, I'm going to have to leave. It's not a question for the last speaker. I have another commitment. In fact, I'm overextending myself, but I do want to thank the people that spoke and the ones that are going to speak now, and also staff for the great presentation that George, and sounds like he's read all the ordinances in California, but or most of them anyway. Thank you.
We've read a lot.
I'm going to have to leave, and I'll look forward to the next staff report.
I was all set to say good morning, but I can no longer say that. Good afternoon. My name is Phil Maddox. I'm the owner of Lone Buffalo Vineyards, one of the wineries. And I would like to express a concern that has been a concern that I've had since this process started. And it's that Tina mentioned keeping the winery ordinance and the community center ordinance separate, and I think that's a very important consideration. I think there's a fundamental difference between wineries who want to be event centers and other types of operations that want to be event centers. And the fundamental difference is this. Wineries, by definition, are an agricultural activity. They produce an agricultural product, and nearly everything they do is related in some way to grape growing, winemaking, and the sale of wine. So I think it's important that these things be kept separate, but I do see as this process moves along, I'm starting to see from my sort of other hat, I happen to be a lawyer, I see the potential for a lot of conflict between the winery ordinance and the community center ordinance if we don't have these potential conflicts in mind at the time we start. It's a little bit difficult to predict how it's going to turn out because we don't know. I think we're further along in this process with the community center ordinance than we are with the modifications to the winery ordinance. But I just think it's something that I'd like to bring to the Commission's attention, and also certainly to the Planning Department's attention, that we keep in mind that these are separate organizations, and perhaps we even ought to look at a situation where any winery, if they want something beyond what the winery ordinance eventually winds up allowing, then fine, they can become a community center or an agricultural community center. I'm not too clear of the nomenclature yet. But they shouldn't be required to meet those requirements if they're doing activities that might otherwise fall under the community center ordinance. They ought to be regulated under the winery ordinance. And I'm just bringing this matter up at this point. Given it some thought, I don't really have any clear ideas about how that ought to be done, except that perhaps it might be possible to create an exemption from the community center ordinance for a winery unless they want to become one of the large agricultural event centers, I think it is, that would perhaps be in excess of what they'd be allowed to do under the winery ordinance. That's all.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Marilyn Jasper. Thank you so much for listening to us for the staff report and being receptive and open to our suggestions and our concerns. I want to state that we fully support everything that Carol Rubin Save Placer Farmlands presented both today and in the packet. That nails it. I think in some place she has stated we might not all agree on the details, and that's what I'd like to just go over a little bit here. We, some organizations that I represent, tend to want to take this a little bit more restrictive, a little bit more conservative side than the more generous, flexible side. I think the devil is in the details, and once those ordinances and codes are written for code enforcement to be effective, which is, to me, the crux of the whole thing, those details have to be solid. And so just to hit on a few, they may seem a little weird, but just off the top, I don't think sunset is reasonable. It's a cloudy day. I didn't know the sun went down. Or whatever. I think it's got to be set time, period. And then we don't have this problem of, well, you went past your hour. The other thing, with the private roads, I happen to be on a private road, and it's not just I agree with what the easement's there, you have the right, 40 feet, 50 feet, whatever it is. But you try to get 10 people together to agree whether they're going to reseal, resurface, we're getting bids on maintenance, and upkeep is where the big problem comes in. Not a problem, but the work comes in. You got to get bids, and then you got to get everybody. Will you agree to pay the $1,200, whatever your share is? And so if an event operator says, okay, I'll pay for widening this road and making it comply with fire safe, it's the maintenance over the next 10, 15 years that kicks in, and now you've got people saying, well, you're bringing 100 people in here. I just bring in my family or whatever. So I think private roads should not be a part of this. If you're on a private road, you don't have an event center designation. You can still have some events with your TOEs or whatever is allowed. The contact phone number, good idea, probably needs to be a part of the process. But from my experience with citations, you call that number because you work out a settlement. They're not there. They're there, but they're not answering the phone. You get the message machine. And I can speak from my incidences, it's useless. It's good to have, though, because you may have a response. I think we had one applicant say, I do answer that phone during events. So I think it's a good idea, but as far as self-enforcement, I don't think that's going to work. And I think we're getting close. We've been circling around this now for 2 years, whatever, and I think we're getting close to some ordinances or some language and hopefully enforcement. Just as an aside, I had to turn something in late because I've been out of town, and both going and coming home on Interstate 80 between Sacramento and the Bay Area, there are produce stands, and going both ways, every one that I saw had parking lots full of people buying, I presume, buying produce. I think there are other options, economic viability options for our ag people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've heard of that from everyone, in which case I'll bring the public hearing to a close and return to discussion from the board. Does anybody here have questions or comments?
Question, if I can ask it of George?
Fire away, Jeff.
The ag buildings like bars and that have an exemption from the building permit process? Well, I mean, you can go build a barn on an agricultural piece of property, and aside from meeting setbacks and stuff, there's not a permit issued for building that building, and it's not, you're not paying school impact fees and those kind of things on it.
There's a different level for ag buildings of review, but with that different level of review, it's not the same kind of residential home. It doesn't qualify to have anything but agricultural implements in it, agricultural storage. It won't work as a tasting room. It won't work as a meeting place.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure is we had an ability to differentiate between what we're calling a bar and an agricultural building versus what we're building to truly entertain people and guests in.
If you're going to have an agricultural event center, that building will need to meet the standard that any event center would need to meet for people to occupy it in a social gathering manner. You can't throw up a barn at an ag standard and have that be the place where you meet. It's not ADA compliant. You have to have all those things. You have to have ADA compliant bathrooms. This won't work.
Okay. Any other questions?
I've got a question for George too. On the since it got brought up on the winery ordinance that we're considering as well, would what we're talking about today also apply to wineries? They're not exempt from what we're talking about today.
Oh, okay. Here's the tricky part. What Mr. Maddox said keeps me up at night, because there is this spot that wineries occupy. A winery is allowed on a 4.6 acre parcel, and there is this spot where when we delve into the winery ordinance that we're going to have to discuss about a different level of appropriate type events that a winery might be able to have. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm glad you brought this up because I was going to bring this up hopefully before you left, there is a possibility of, in the existing community center ordinance, and it would translate well into the winery ordinance, of allowing very controlled, smaller type events, maybe as a matter of right, that would translate from this ordinance into the winery ordinance. Because when we get into the winery ordinance, we're going to have to look at things like winemaker dinners in wine tasting rooms on smaller pieces of property, 4.6 acres, because there's wineries on 4.6 acre parcels. And the question will be, how do you implement those? Is it an unlimited number? Is it completely inside with no outdoor activity? And so there's this next sort of little component that's going to come when the winery ordinance takes up, and it's going to be that space between 4.6 and whatever the bottom of the community center ordinance is. And quite possibly, if you want to exceed what you can do through the winery ordinance right now, as you would today, maybe you need to jump up into the community center regulations. But there is that gap where most of the wineries fall, that 4.6 to 10 acre. There's a lot of wineries in there that we're going to have to look at.
Well, isn't, I mean, if we're talking about an agricultural event center,
right,
isn't that a winery?
It could be, except if you start an agricultural event center at 10 acres, then you have wineries by ordinance today that are at 4.6. So when we get into the winery ordinance, we're going to have to look at it in the context of what we've looked at in the community center and extrapolate, for lack of a better term, downward to the winery level and come up with some levels of appropriateness and uses allowed. It won't be dissimilar from the process that we went through for community centers. It will just be in that gap.
So are we, again, my original question is, are wineries exempt from what we're discussing today on agricultural?
I can't tell you that until the winery ordinance is done.
I think the important takeaway here is that the board's direction, which staff is following, is to keep these ordinances separate.
Right.
The winery ordinance is separate from the community center. ordinance. So what we're dealing with here today is simply the community center issues, not the winery and related events that might be associated with the winery. That would be the separate discussion.
Right. So at some point, your question will become clear and answered. As we go through the winery, at some point, it may become subject to community centers, or it may extend.
Well, event centers.
Event centers, I'm sorry.
You know, community center, I don't know what we're talking about.
I meant agricultural event centers.
Right. Okay.
I'm not the only one that gets confused sometimes.
Please get some sleep.
Any other questions for staff? In which case, I declare the meeting closed.